There is a city at the centre of the world, not at the centre in the way a geographer would draw it on a map, not the precise mathematical midpoint of any measured continent, but at the centre in the way that certain places become the axis upon which human history seems to quietly rotate. Jerusalem. Even the sound of the word carries something ancient in it, something that moves through the chest like the low resonance of a bell struck in a very large, very silent room. Jerusalem, the city of gold and blood, of prayers and wars, of sacred silence and terrible screaming. The city that three of the world's great religions would each claim as their holiest ground, their deepest spiritual root, the place where heaven and earth brushed closest against each other and left a mark that could never fully fade. In the 12th century, Jerusalem was not merely a city. It was a kingdom carved out of the dust and blood of the First Crusade, won at extraordinary cost by men who had marched from the cold, northern shores of Europe across mountain ranges and burning plains, who had endured starvation and disease and ambush and the despair of the very long road. They had come believing they were soldiers of God, instruments of divine will, warriors in a sacred cause. And in the year 1099, after a siege that lasted 5 weeks, they had broken through the walls of Jerusalem and claimed the holy city in a torrent of violence so profound that contemporary chronicles describe the blood running through the streets deep enough to reach a horse's fetlocks. It was not a gentle beginning. It was not a peaceful dawn. The kingdom of Jerusalem was born in fire. And yet, and this is one of the remarkable and endlessly fascinating paradoxes of this place and this time, the kingdom that grew from that brutal foundation became something far more complex and far more interesting than a simple military outpost of European Christendom. Over the decades that followed, the Crusader settlers, their descendants, and the generations born in that sun-drenched ancient land began to build something genuinely strange and genuinely remarkable. They built a society that was in many ways unlike anything in the world at that moment, a place where Latin Christians, Eastern Christians, Muslims and Jews lived in varying degrees of proximity and at times even cooperation, where the great lords of the kingdom found themselves negotiating as often as they were fighting, where the architecture blended Romanesque solidity with the cool, shaded arcades of the Islamic tradition, where a knight from Burgundy might find himself in conversation with a merchant from Damascus over the price of Syrian silk, and where that conversation might be conducted in a language that was neither French nor Arabic but something blurring in between. This was the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem, fragile from the beginning, surrounded on all sides by enemies who had never truly accepted its existence, dependent on a steady trickle of reinforcements and supplies from a Europe that was far away and often distracted, torn within by the ambitions of great lords, the intrigues of powerful women, the rivalries of military orders, and the eternal human hungers for wealth, power, and recognition. It was a kingdom that felt, even in its most prosperous moments, like a flame burning in a high wind, brilliant and beautiful and terrifyingly vulnerable. And it was into this kingdom, into this specific, extraordinary, precarious world, that a boy was born in the year 1161. A boy who would, against every conceivable expectation, against the weight of a disease that was slowly consuming him from the inside, against the pressures of a court full of scheming adults, against the armies of one of the greatest military commanders the medieval world ever produced, become a king whose story has never fully been equalled in the long, astonishing history of human perseverance. His name was Baldwin. He would come to be known by those who lived in his time and by all those who have studied his life in the centuries since as the Leper King. It is a name that carries a particular kind of weight, a name that contains within it the two most essential truths of who he was and what he endured, the disease that ate away at his body year by year, and the crown that sat on a head that refused even so to bow. To understand Baldwin IV, to truly understand him and not simply to catalogue the facts of his reign, we need to understand the world that formed him. We need to feel the heat of the Jerusalem sun, that particular, specific, almost physical quality of light that falls on the hills around the holy city, that warm golden pressure that seems to push down on the shoulders like a gentle but insistent hand. We need to understand the smell of the place, the dust, the incense drifting from the church of the Holy Sepulchre, the animals in the market streets, the cooking fires, the particular metallic scent that lingers in old stone walls after centuries of being baked by the sun. We need to understand what it meant to be alive in this place in this century, what people feared, what they hoped for, what they believed about God and fate and the proper ordering of the world. The 12th century was a century of enormous turbulent change. In Europe, the great cathedrals were rising, those astonishing acts of collective faith and architectural genius that still draw the breath from visitors who stand in their light-filled interiors and look up at the soaring vaults. In the Islamic world, a great renewal was underway, a reassertion of power and purpose that would, before the century was done, fundamentally reshape the political landscape of the Middle East. The Crusader kingdom sat at the intersection of all of this, a meeting point of civilizations, a flashpoint of faiths, a place where the largest questions of the age were being worked out not merely in theology and philosophy, but in blood and iron and the desperate mathematics of battlefield survival. Jerusalem in the 12th century was a city of extraordinary sensory richness. The market streets, the souks, were alive with the noise and colour of a dozen different trades. Spice merchants displayed their wares in great piled heaps of colour, the deep red of sumac, the golden yellow of saffron, the warm brown of cinnamon. Silk merchants hung lengths of the most exquisite fabric in doorways, where they caught the light and seemed almost to glow. Craftsmen hammered and shaped and carved in tiny workshops that opened directly onto the street. Pilgrims moved through it all in a constant, reverent stream, men and women who had travelled extraordinary distances to stand in the place where, they believed with all their hearts, the Son of God had walked and suffered and risen. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre dominated the city's spiritual geography, but the city was full of other sacred spaces. The golden dome of the Rock caught the sun on the Temple Mount, casting its light across the city like a benediction. The Al-Aqsa Mosque, which the Crusaders had converted into a palace and a church, but which remained in the memory of every Muslim in the known world as one of the holiest places in Islam. The narrow streets and high walls and hidden courtyards of the old city, each one layered over centuries of human habitation like geological strata, each stone in every wall carrying within it the silent record of everything that had happened here. The royal palace of Jerusalem stood near the Jaffa Gate, looking out over the walls toward the west, toward the road that led eventually down to the sea, toward Jaffa and Caesarea, and the great blue expanse of the Mediterranean that was the kingdom's lifeline to the European world. The palace was a complex of rooms and courtyards that had been built and rebuilt over generations of Crusader rule, accumulating the architectural preferences of each successive dynasty, a layering of styles that somehow cohered into something that felt both grand and intimate, both imposing and surprisingly human in its proportions. This was where Baldwin was born. This was where he grew up. This was the world that shaped him. Around the kingdom, the world was watching. To the north, the Crusader states of Antioch and Tripoli clung to their own precarious existences, ruled by lords whose ambitions and rivalries created as many problems for Jerusalem as the external enemies did. To the east, across the Jordan River, lay the vast territories of the Islamic world, territories that were, in the middle decades of the 12th century, in the process of being united under a series of increasingly powerful and increasingly focused leaders. And from those territories, one particular man was beginning to emerge, a man of Kurdish origin, brilliant in strategy, personally devout, charismatic to his followers, and deeply disturbing to his enemies. A man who would eventually become the defining challenge of Baldwin's entire reign, the human embodiment of the force that threatened to end everything the Crusader kingdom had built. His name was Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub. The world would come to know him as Saladin. But that is a story for a little later. For now, we begin where all stories truly begin, not with the great forces and the large historical movements, but with a child, a small boy in a sun-drenched courtyard, a child with dark eyes and quick intelligence, playing with his companions in the afternoon heat. A child who did not yet know, could not yet know, the extraordinary weight of destiny that was already gathering around him like a slow, patient tide. A child who, on a day that his teacher would later record with quiet sorrow, did something that every child does, played a game with his friends in the palace gardens, and in playing that game, revealed a truth about his body that would change everything. Everything about his life. Everything about his kingdom. Everything about the long, painful, magnificent story that was waiting for him to grow into it. Baldwin was born in 1161, the son of King Amalric I of Jerusalem and his queen, Agnes of Courtenay. To understand Baldwin, it helps enormously to understand his parents, because they were in many ways the living embodiment of the contradictions and pressures that shaped the kingdom he would inherit. Amalric was a man of considerable intelligence and genuine political ability, a king who understood the fragility of his position and worked hard when he could to strengthen it. He was large and heavy-set, with a tendency towards stoutness that he shared, according to the chronicles, with a certain embarrassing physical detail. He had such a pronounced stammer that he would occasionally pause in mid-sentence, his face reddening, struggling to force words past whatever invisible obstruction blocked them. He was said to laugh frequently and loudly, often at inappropriate moments, an involuntary response that he could not entirely control. These small, human, almost endearing imperfections remind us that these great historical figures were, in the end, people, real people, with real bodies and real vulnerabilities, not the abstract figures of legend. Agnes of Courtenay was a more complicated figure. She was the daughter of Jocelyn II of Edessa, a Crusader lord whose county had been lost to the Muslim reconquest before Agnes was fully grown, a formative loss that likely shaped her understanding of just how precarious the Crusader world truly was. She was, by all accounts, a woman of beauty and considerable personal charm, possessed of a political intelligence that her many enemies in the Jerusalem court consistently underestimated. Those enemies were numerous and vocal. The great lords and the churchmen of the kingdom disapproved of her marriage to Amalric for reasons that mixed genuine canonical concern with naked social snobbery. Agnes's family was considered insufficiently prestigious for a king of Jerusalem, and the Patriarch of Jerusalem and the High Court had opposed the match on those grounds. When Amalric became king in 1163, he was required, as a condition of his coronation, to set Agnes aside, to annul their marriage. He did so, but he fought for and won one crucial concession. Their children, Baldwin and his sister Sibylla, would remain legitimate, would remain in the succession, would retain all their royal rights. Amalric loved his children. This much at least seems clear across the centuries. He would not sacrifice them, even when he was prepared to sacrifice their mother. Agnes did not disappear from the story, however. She was by nature not the sort of woman who disappeared from any story she'd entered. She was remarried, first to Hugh of Ibelin and later to Reginald of Sidon, and she remained a presence in the kingdom's political life, particularly in the orbit of her children. Her relationship with the court remained contentious throughout. She was accused by her enemies of all manner of sins, of sexual immorality and political manipulation, and the selling of church offices, accusations that must be evaluated carefully, since they came almost exclusively from men who despised her and who had their own axes to grind. The truth of Agnes of Courtenay is likely somewhere between the monster her enemies painted and the paragon her defenders imagined. A shrewd, ambitious woman navigating a world that offered women very limited formal power and required extraordinary informal skill to move through effectively. Young Baldwin grew up in the court of Jerusalem, which was, by the standards of his age, a remarkably sophisticated and cosmopolitan environment. The royal court was multilingual, French and the local Crusader dialect, a kind of evolved Norman French that had absorbed words from Arabic and Greek and Italian, were the primary languages of the court, but Arabic was widely understood, and Latin remained the language of the church and of formal documents. Baldwin would have heard all of these languages from his earliest childhood, absorbing them as children do effortlessly, the way they absorb everything in those early years, when the mind is simply open and receptive and endlessly hungry for pattern and meaning. His formal education was entrusted to one of the most remarkable men of his age, William, Archbishop of Tyre, the man who had become the great chronicler of the Crusader kingdom, and whose Historia Rerum in Partibus Transmarinis Gestarum, the history of deeds done beyond the sea, remains to this day one of the primary sources for everything we know about the Kingdom of Jerusalem in the 12th century. William was a man of exceptional intellect and wide learning. He had studied in Europe for many years, at the great schools of Paris and Bologna, absorbing the best scholarship his age had to offer in theology, law, history, rhetoric, and philosophy. He spoke multiple languages fluently, including Arabic, and he had a historian's eye for the telling detail and a teacher's gift for making the past live and breathe. He was, in short, precisely the sort of tutor a young prince could hope for, and his affection for the boy and his care comes through clearly in his writing, a warmth between the lines of the chronicle that makes those passages feel different from the more formal historical narrative, more personal, more tender, and more sad. William describes Baldwin as a quick and eager student. The boy loved learning. He was curious about everything, quick to understand difficult ideas, possessed of an excellent memory that retained what he learned and could call it back precisely when needed. He was athletic and energetic in the way of healthy boys everywhere. He loved riding and hunting and the physical competitions that young men of his class were raised to excel in. He was, by all accounts, a genuinely appealing child, intelligent and lively and warm in his relationships with the people around him. William clearly adored him. The pride and sorrow that saturate every page of William's account of Baldwin's life and illness suggest a man who had loved his pupil as a son, who had poured all of his considerable learning and care into this boy's formation, and who had then watched, helpless and heartbroken, as the invisible enemy already present in that small, bright body began its slow and terrible work. The discovery of Baldwin's leprosy is one of the most quietly devastating scenes in the historical record of the Middle Ages. William of Tyre recorded it with a directness that feels almost unbearable in its simplicity. The Archbishop writes that he noticed one day while the children were at play that Baldwin and his companions were engaged in a game that was common among boys of that time and place, a competition to see who could endure the most pain by digging their fingernails into one another's forearms. The other boys winced and cried out. Baldwin did not. He sat through it without reaction, without flinching, apparently feeling nothing at all. William summoned the boy and examined him more carefully. The lack of sensation in his right arm was not the result of courage or stoicism. It was the result of something already happening inside that young body, something that had quietly established itself while no one was watching, while Baldwin laughed and studied and rode horses and did all the things that healthy boys do. The numbness was the first sign of leprosy. William recognised it. He called physicians. The physicians confirmed what the Archbishop feared. The crown prince of the Kingdom of Jerusalem had leprosy. We should pause here, because this moment deserves more than a passing acknowledgement. We should try to imagine what this meant, what it felt like for everyone involved. For William of Tyre, who had devoted years of his life to shaping this boy's mind and character, and who now faced the knowledge that the body housing all that intelligence and promise was beginning to be consumed by a disease that medicine in his century could do almost nothing about. For the physicians, who had to compose their faces into professional calm while delivering information that they knew would land like a blow. And for Baldwin himself, still a child, still in the years when the world is largely experienced as a series of immediate present sensations, and not yet as the long forward projection of time that adults learn to live inside. Did he understand fully what it meant? Did the physicians use the word leprosy in his hearing? Did he see it in their faces before they could manage to hide it? We do not know exactly what Baldwin was told, or how, or by whom. William of Tyre's account is careful and restrained at this point, as if the pain of recounting it required a kind of formal distance to be survivable. What we do know is that the knowledge did not crush the boy. Whatever was said, in whatever form, Baldwin absorbed it and continued. He continued studying, continued riding, continued growing into the young man that his kingdom needed him to be. This ability to absorb a terrible truth and continue, to keep moving, keep learning, keep showing up, is perhaps the first and most essential element of the character that would define his reign. Amalric I died in 1174 when Baldwin was 13 years old. Amalric was only 38, young by any measure, and his death was sudden, the consequence of a severe bout of dysentery following a military campaign. The news must have fallen on the young Baldwin with the particular vertiginous quality of a loss that is both deeply personal and immediately crushingly political. His father was dead. His father had been the shield between him and the full weight of the kingdom's demands, and now that shield was gone and the full weight was his. Baldwin IV was crowned King of Jerusalem in the summer of 1174. He was 13 years old. He was the sole legitimate male heir of the Ayyubid line. He was already ill. The disease had progressed beyond the first signs of numbness. It had moved into his face and hands, beginning the slow, disfiguring work that leprosy did in its advanced stages. He wore gloves. He had begun to lose sensation more broadly. He could see, in the faces of the people around him when they thought he wasn't looking, the particular expression that medieval people wore when they looked at a leper, that compound of pity and revulsion and fear that no amount of courtly training could entirely erase from the human face. He was crowned anyway. He sat on the throne of the Kingdom of Jerusalem and let the crown be placed on his head. He took the oaths. He received the homage of his lords. He was 13, and ill and frightened and extraordinary. The reign of the Leper King had begun. Because he was a minor, the kingdom required a regent to govern in his name during the years before he came of age. The choice fell initially on Miles of Plancy, a man of ambition who had been a favourite of the later Amalric, but who lacked the political skill to navigate the complex currents of the Jerusalem court. Miles was deeply unpopular with the powerful baronial families, men like the Ibelins, the great clan of lords whose influence ran through the kingdom like a root system through soil. His tenure as regent was brief and turbulent, ending with his assassination in the autumn of 1174, just months after he had taken the position. The murder was never officially solved, but few in the kingdom were particularly surprised or distressed by it. The great lords had been offended by his overreaching, and the kingdom did not tolerate those who overreached for long. The regency passed to Raymond III, Count of Tripoli, a man of far greater ability and experience. Raymond was a complex figure, intelligent and politically astute, possessed of a genuine strategic mind, but also personally difficult and sometimes exasperatingly rigid in his opinions. He had spent years as a prisoner of the Muslims after being captured in battle, and those years of captivity had left him with an unusual depth of knowledge of the Islamic world and an unusual willingness to consider diplomacy where others reached immediately for the sword. He was not universally loved in the kingdom. Powerful figures like Raynal of Châtillon regarded him with active hostility, but he was respected, and in a time of crisis, respect was worth a great deal. Under Raymond's regency, the young king received the space to grow into something like a working understanding of the demands that awaited him. But the regency was always a temporary arrangement, always a placeholder. The real story was Baldwin himself, the boy king, growing older, growing more ill, and growing simultaneously into a ruler of astonishing capability. To understand what Baldwin endured, we must understand leprosy as it was known and experienced in the 12th century, not as we understand it now, with the clinical clarity of modern medicine, but as the people of that time understood it, a fearful, mysterious, stigmatized disease that carried layers of meaning far beyond the purely physical. And to do that, we need to follow the disease from its first subtle signs all the way through its slow, terrible progression, because the story of Baldwin's reign is inseparable from the story of what was happening inside his body, day by day and year by year, during every campaign and every council and every quiet hour in the palace. Leprosy, caused by the bacterium Mycobacterium leprae, is, by modern standards, not the most physically destructive of infectious diseases. It progresses slowly, over years and decades, and it is far less contagious than the medieval world believed. But the form of leprosy that appears to have afflicted Baldwin, lepromatous leprosy, sometimes called nodular leprosy, the most severe form of the disease, is a progressive and disfiguring condition that attacks the peripheral nervous system, the skin, the eyes, and the respiratory system. It causes numbness by destroying nerve endings, beginning typically in the extremities and working its way inward over time. It causes the distinctive skin lesions and thickening, the nodules and plaques that alter the face, the hands, the feet, into shapes that medieval observers found deeply disturbing. It attacks the eyes, eventually leading to blindness. It damages the cartilage of the nose and can collapse it. It can cripple the hands and feet as the tendons contract, and the bones are gradually reabsorbed by the body. And all of this happens slowly, over years, over decades, so that the person with the disease has the particular grinding experience of watching themselves change, of measuring the distance between who they were and who they are becoming, of living in a body that is simultaneously themselves and becoming something else. In the 12th century, leprosy was understood through a combination of medical theory inherited from ancient Greece and Rome, biblical tradition, and lived experience. The medical theories, derived from the work of Hippocrates and Galen and transmitted through the great Arabic medical tradition, described leprosy as a corruption of the blood, a fundamental imbalance of the humours, particularly an excess of black bile or melancholy, that manifested in the slow destruction of the body's tissues. Treatments existed. They were prescribed and administered with varying degrees of hope and consistency, but they were almost entirely ineffective by modern standards. Physicians recommended dietary modifications, bloodletting to balance the humours, various herbal preparations applied to the skin, bathing regimens. None of these could arrest the disease's progression. They could, at most, provide modest symptomatic relief, and perhaps more importantly, the psychological comfort of doing something in the face of something that could not truly be stopped. The biblical dimension of leprosy added an additional layer of complexity and pain to the experience of the disease that is difficult for modern readers to fully appreciate. In the Old Testament, leprosy, or what the Hebrew text calls zerath, which may have referred to a range of skin conditions beyond what we now specifically classify as Mycobacterium leprae infection, is treated as a condition with profound spiritual implications. The priest, not the physician, was the designated authority for diagnosing and declaring leprosy in the Hebrew Bible. A leper was required to wear torn clothing, leave their hair disheveled, cover the lower part of their face and cry out, "Unclean, unclean," as a warning to others. They were required to dwell outside the normal human community, separated from the social and spiritual life of their people. The symbolism was hard and clear. Leprosy was not merely a physical disease, but a state of ritual impurity, a separation from the community of the clean and the blessed, a mark of something gone profoundly wrong at a level that transcended the merely medical. This biblical framework had filtered into Christian medieval culture and complicated it in interesting ways. On one hand, the leper in the New Testament was a figure of special divine concern. Jesus had healed lepers, had touched them, had restored them not just physically but to community, to full human belonging. The imitation of Christ had led to a remarkable tradition of Christian care for lepers. Hospitals specifically dedicated to lepers existed across the medieval world, staffed by monks and nuns and lay brothers and sisters who saw in the care of the leper's body an imitation of Christ's own compassionate touch. The military order of St. Lazarus, based in Jerusalem, was dedicated specifically to the care and, when possible, the military service of lepers, and we will meet this order again in the story of Baldwin's life. On the other hand, the older association of leprosy with spiritual corruption persisted alongside this charitable tradition, a dark undercurrent of suspicion that the person afflicted might, in some sense, have deserved their affliction, might be marked by God as someone who had sinned, who was being visibly corrected, who carried in their body a sign of interior disorder. For a king, this theological complexity was particularly acute. A king was not merely a person. A king was, in medieval understanding, a sacred figure, anointed by God through the ceremony of coronation, set apart from ordinary humanity by a divine commission to rule and protect and judge. The king's body was not merely a private matter. The king's body was a political and religious symbol, a visible representation of the health and order and divine favour of the entire realm. What did it mean when that body was afflicted with the disease most associated with impurity and spiritual disorder? The court must have wrestled with this question throughout Baldwin's reign, and the answer they arrived at, the working answer, the practical answer, was remarkable. They answered it by watching what Baldwin actually did, and finding in his actions a kind of evidence that overrode the symbolic anxiety. A king who could fight like Baldwin fought, who could think like Baldwin thought, who could hold together a fractious and endangered kingdom the way Baldwin held it. That king was clearly not abandoned by God, whatever his body suggested. But we are running ahead of the story. Let us return to the disease itself, to the physical reality of what Baldwin lived with every day, because this reality is absolutely central to understanding why his achievements were so remarkable. By the time of his coronation at 13, Baldwin had already lost significant sensation in his right arm. This was not a trivial impairment. His right arm was his sword arm, the arm with which, if he was to be a warrior king in the tradition his culture demanded, he would need to fight. The loss of sensation meant, among other things, that he could grip a sword but not feel the grip. He could swing a blade but not feel the impact when it struck. He could fight, and he did fight repeatedly with documented effectiveness. But he fought without the proprioceptive feedback that healthy fighters use to adjust their technique moment by moment. Every time he fought, he risked injury to his hands and arms without knowing it, because the body's normal warning system, pain, was silent in him where the disease had already done its work. As the years passed, the disease progressed, the numbness spread, the skin lesions appeared and developed on his face, his hands, eventually his whole body. His face began to change in the ways characteristic of lepromatous leprosy. The thickening of the skin, the nodular formations, the collapse and distortion of features that gave sufferers of this form of the disease what medieval observers sometimes called the leonine face, a heaviness, a thickening, a slow loss of the finer lineaments of individual expression. His eyes were affected. Toward the end of his reign, he had lost his sight entirely, or very nearly so. His hands, already insensible, began to lose their structural integrity as the tendons contracted and the disease progressed into the bones. By the final years of his life, he could not walk unaided. He had to be carried to the battlefield on a litter. He dictated letters because he could no longer hold a pen. He navigated a world that he could barely see and could not physically touch in the way he once had, relying on the voices of those around him, on his memory of faces he could no longer quite make out, on the quality of the light and the sounds and smells that the disease had not yet stolen from him. And through all of this, through every stage of this slow, inexorable physical diminishment, he ruled. He gave orders that were followed. He made strategic decisions that proved brilliant. He held his court together through sheer force of will and intelligence. He earned the respect and in some cases the deep love of men who were among the most capable warriors of their age. He faced Saladin in the field and won. He fought a disease and an empire simultaneously, and for years that seemed at times almost miraculous, he prevailed over both. The emotional and psychological dimensions of Baldwin's experience deserve their own sustained attention. Medieval culture did not typically provide its members with a vocabulary for what we would now call the inner life of suffering, the long private conversation that takes place between a person and their own pain, the negotiation and the grief, and the strange accommodations that people make with circumstances they cannot change. But we can read between the lines of what the chronicles record about his behaviour, his decisions, his relationships, and find in those spaces something of what he must have felt. There is the question of isolation. Leprosy in the 12th century was believed to be highly contagious, transmitted through touch, through shared air, through the proximity of bodies. The medical and social response to this belief was a distancing, a set of protocols designed to keep the leper separate from the unaffected world. For Baldwin, this isolation was paradoxically both more and less severe than it was for most lepers. More severe in some respects because he was a public figure who could not simply withdraw from the world. His role required him to be present, visible, accessible, in a way that most lepers were not. Less severe in others because his status as king gave him a kind of immunity to the most brutal social consequences of the disease. No one was going to exile the King of Jerusalem. No one was going to force him to cry unclean in the streets. But the isolation was there nonetheless, in the gloves he wore to cover his damaged hands, in the increasing covering of his face, in the growing physical distance that his condition required between himself and the people he loved. We know he had a loving relationship with his sister Sibylla, that they were close throughout his life. We know he cared for his mother Agnes, and maintained her presence in his court despite the opposition of the barons. What it cost him, what it cost all of them, to navigate that closeness across the distance that disease imposes, we can only imagine. There is also the question of what Baldwin thought about his own future. By the middle years of his reign, it must have been clear to him, it was certainly clear to everyone around him, that he could not reign indefinitely, that the disease would eventually render him unable to function as king, and that the question of succession was not merely a political abstraction, but a matter of urgent and approaching necessity. He had no children of his own. Marriage and legitimate procreation were essentially impossible for him, not merely because of the physical progression of his disease, but because of the political and social implications of the question of hereditary transmission. No noble woman could be asked to marry a leper king. The succession would have to come through his sister Sibylla, and the man Sibylla chose to marry would become, in effect, the heir to everything Baldwin was fighting to preserve. That knowledge, that the thing he was sacrificing himself to protect would pass into someone else's hands, that the kingdom he was holding together at such personal cost would be ruled, after him, by a man whose qualities he was already beginning to doubt, must have been one of the hardest things Baldwin carried. The daily pain, the isolation, the physical diminishment. These were his own, personal, private sufferings. But the political anxiety about the succession was a different kind of pain, a forward-reaching ache, a worry about the future, about whether all of it, all the exhausting, painful, magnificent effort of his reign, would be enough to matter after he was gone. The answer, as history would record it, was complicated, and we will get to it. But first we must watch him fight. In the autumn of 1177, something happened on a plain south of Jerusalem that historians have been trying to fully account for ever since, because it sits at such an unusual intersection of the improbable and the real. A 16-year-old leper king commanding a force of perhaps 500 knights, and whatever infantry he could muster, met the army of Saladin, an army that contemporaries estimated at between 26,000 and 30,000 men, in open battle, and the Leper King won. The Battle of Montgisard is not well known outside specialised circles of medieval history, which is a genuine injustice, because it belongs on any honest list of the most remarkable military engagements of the medieval world. Let us reconstruct it carefully, because every detail matters. Every decision illuminates something essential about who Baldwin was and what he was capable of. Saladin had entered the kingdom in force. He had crossed from Egypt. He was at this time controlling Egypt as well as much of the territory to the east and north of the Crusader kingdom, and was moving north along the coastal plain, the Via Maris, the ancient highway that hugged the sea. His intention was probably a raid in force rather than a full conquest attempt, a demonstration of strength, a gathering of plunder, a probing of the kingdom's defences and reactions. His army was enormous by any standard of the age. He moved with confidence, perhaps with something approaching contempt for the capacity of the diminished Crusader force to oppose him effectively in the field. Baldwin had only just escaped from a separate and embarrassing situation. He had been at Ascalon pinned down by a separate portion of Saladin's forces under the command of Saladin's nephew Farrukh Shah, unable to break out and join the rest of his forces. When he finally managed to escape the encirclement at Ascalon and reunite with his knights, he found himself at the head of a force that was, in numerical terms, comically outmatched. 500 knights. The main army of Saladin was somewhere to the north and east, moving through the coastal plain, dispersed as armies on the march often dispersed. Foragers and detachments spread across the countryside, the main body perhaps not expecting any serious opposition to materialise from the south and west. Baldwin had something that Saladin, at that moment, did not. He had surprise, and he had, it would prove, the kind of tactical genius that looks simple in retrospect but requires real insight in the moment, the ability to see how the numbers of an engagement can be completely transformed by timing and positioning, and the ruthless exploitation of the enemy's assumptions. The Crusaders rode hard. Baldwin rode at their head. We know this. The chronicles are clear that he fought personally in this battle, in the vanguard, on horseback, leading from the front despite everything his body was doing to him. They caught Saladin's army at a place called Tel Jezza, near the ancient site of Geza, on the coastal plain. Saladin's forces were strung out on the march, unprepared for a cavalry charge, caught between the sudden appearance of the Crusader knights and their own inability to form up quickly enough into a defensive line. What followed was less a battle than a rout. The Crusader knights crashed into Saladin's army like a steel fist into a bucket of water, the force of the charge dispersing and destroying before effective resistance could be organised. Saladin himself barely escaped, fleeing south toward Egypt with what remained of his personal guard, leaving behind enormous quantities of equipment, supplies, prisoners, and a great many dead. Estimates of Saladin's losses vary, but they were genuinely severe. The battle was a catastrophe for him in human and material terms. Back in Jerusalem, the reaction was ecstatic. This was a victory that the kingdom had desperately needed, not just militarily, but psychologically, emotionally, spiritually. A victory that proved the kingdom was still capable of defending itself, still capable of meeting its enemies in the field and prevailing. A victory that was, by any honest measure, the direct product of the young king's courage and tactical judgment. Baldwin had fought at the head of his knights on a day when his disease was already visible on his face, already eating at his hands, already compromising his body in ways that would have ended lesser men's military careers entirely. He fought anyway, and he won. The Battle of Montesar was not the only military achievement of Baldwin's reign, though it was perhaps the most dramatic. The patterns of his military leadership, visible across the full span of his time on the throne, reveal a consistent strategic intelligence that is all the more remarkable for being exercised under such extraordinary physical constraints. He understood, with a clarity rare for his age, the strategic logic of the Crusader kingdom's position. The kingdom was always outnumbered. It could not win a war of attrition against the Islamic powers surrounding it. Its survival depended on a combination of factors: the defensibility of its fortifications, the strength and cohesion of its mounted forces, the management of diplomatic relationships with its neighbours, and the maintenance of its sea lanes to Europe. A Crusader king who understood this strategic reality, who resisted the temptation to overextend, who chose his battles carefully, who fortified as readily as he fought, was a king who could preserve his kingdom. A king who let his barons' appetite for glory and plunder drag him into unnecessary fights on disadvantageous ground, was a king who might win individual battles and lose the larger war. Baldwin was, in this framework, a king of the first type. He was capable of extraordinary offensive action when the opportunity was right. Montesar proved that. But he was also capable of restraint, of strategic patience, of choosing not to fight when the conditions favoured the enemy. This restraint was not always popular with his more aggressive barons, men like Raynal of Châtillon, who believed that the proper response to every Muslim provocation was immediate and overwhelming force. Baldwin understood, in a way that Raynald never quite managed, that the Kingdom of Jerusalem could not afford to lose battles the way larger powers could. Every loss depleted something that could not easily be replaced. Every defeated knight represented not merely a man, but a piece of equipment, horse, armour, weapons, that had taken years of effort and significant wealth to assemble and could not be quickly replicated. The relationship between Baldwin and Saladin is one of the most fascinating in the medieval period. Not a friendship exactly, but something more complex than simple enmity. The Islamic sources, which portray Saladin in terms that are almost exclusively admiring, nonetheless record his respect for Baldwin. Saladin was many things: brilliant commander, shrewd politician, genuinely devout Muslim. But he was also, in a deep and consistent way, someone who respected worth wherever he found it. The quality he most valued in an opponent was courage, and Baldwin's courage was undeniable. The chronicles record at least one instance in which Saladin, informed of Baldwin's condition, commented on the king's determination with something that sounds, even through the filter of translation and cultural distance, like genuine admiration. There were other significant military engagements in Baldwin's reign beyond Montgisard. In 1179, there was the disastrous Battle of Marj Ayoun, where the Crusaders suffered a serious defeat that ended with the capture of several important nobles, including the Count of Tripoli himself. Baldwin was present, but reportedly unable to prevent the defeat, a reversal that stood in painful contrast to the triumph of 2 years earlier and illustrated the volatile, reversible nature of military fortune in this landscape. Shortly afterward, Saladin captured and destroyed the newly constructed Crusader fortress of Jacob's Ford, a strategic position on the Jordan River that Baldwin had invested enormous resources in building. These were real setbacks, real reversals, real moments where the grinding reality of the kingdom's strategic situation reasserted itself against the inspiring narrative of the young king's courage. But what is remarkable is how consistently Baldwin kept the kingdom intact through these reverses. He negotiated truces when fighting was not viable. He maintained the allegiance of his lords through a combination of personal respect and shrewd political management. He kept Saladin, who was always the larger strategic threat, always the force that could, if conditions were right, simply overwhelm the kingdom by sheer weight of numbers and resources, from achieving the decisive, kingdom-ending victory that he sought. In 1182, with his disease advancing rapidly and his physical capacities diminishing by the month, Baldwin mounted another aggressive military operation, this time in a long-range raid into the Galilee, threatening the strategic position of Saladin's forces in a way that kept the enemy off balance and demonstrated that even in his deteriorating physical condition, the king could still project force and think strategically. The audacity of the campaign, given the state of his health, impressed even those who had been critical of his rule. The following year, 1183, produced one of the most remarkable military standoffs of the entire period. Saladin invaded in overwhelming force, bringing an army of some 70,000 men, an enormous force by any standard of the age, into the kingdom of Jerusalem. Baldwin, by now seriously ill and barely able to remain on horseback, made a decision that was strategically brilliant and personally extraordinary. He mobilized every available fighting man in the kingdom, assembled them near the springs of Safaria, and refused battle on Saladin's terms while refusing to simply retreat. He positioned his army in a defensive formation near a reliable water source, and dared Saladin to come to him on ground of his choosing. Saladin maneuvered, threatened, raided the surrounding countryside, but he could not draw the Crusaders into an engagement on his terms. After weeks of maneuvering, with his enormous army consuming resources at an unsustainable rate, Saladin withdrew without achieving his objective. The kingdom survived. This was a masterpiece of what military strategists call defensive restraint, the willingness to absorb tactical pain in service of strategic preservation. The Crusader barons who had been champing for a fight were furious. They accused Baldwin of cowardice, or more precisely, they accused the Regent Guy of Lusignan, who was technically in nominal command because Baldwin could no longer physically lead from the front, of cowardice and incompetence. Baldwin, witnessing the criticism from his litter, agreed with them that Guy had failed. He revoked Guy's regency and took back personal direction of the kingdom's affairs, taking the reins in his own damaged hands. Even as his body continued to fail him, this decision to retake personal control of the kingdom when his body was already desperately compromised is one of the most revealing moments of Baldwin's character. He was not willing to let the kingdom drift. He was not willing to leave it in the hands of a man he had come to distrust. Even from a litter, even with hands that could no longer grip and eyes that could barely see, he exercised royal authority with a directness and decisiveness that made clear that whatever the disease had taken from him, it had not taken his mind or his will. He had his nephew, the young Baldwin V, Sibylla's son by her first husband, crowned as co-king in 1183, ensuring that the succession was secured regardless of what happened to him personally. He continued to administer the kingdom, to make decisions, to adjudicate disputes, to manage the impossible tensions between the court factions. He was, in every functional sense, still the king, not merely nominally, not in some attenuated ceremonial way, but actually and substantively the governing intelligence of a kingdom in the most dangerous position it had faced since its founding. There are moments in the record of Baldwin's reign when the great sweeping movements of history, the battles, the politics, the diplomacy, step back, and we catch a glimpse of something smaller and more intimate. A young man trying to live a human life inside a situation that was almost inhumanly demanding. These moments are precious precisely because they are rare in the sources, because the medieval chronicle tradition was not built to record the private human experience, but the public historical event. And yet they are there, if you look carefully, and they allow us to see Baldwin not just as a symbol or a strategic actor, but as a person. The royal court of Jerusalem moved, as medieval courts did, between several residences. The primary palace in Jerusalem, the Tower of David complex near the Jaffa Gate, was the administrative centre of the kingdom, the place where the king's council met, where petitions were heard, where the business of government was conducted. But the court also spent time at Acre, the great port city on the Mediterranean coast, that was in many ways the economic heart of the kingdom, the place where the ships from Europe arrived with their cargoes of pilgrims and merchants and occasional military reinforcements. And there were other residences, smaller, more comfortable perhaps, where the court could retreat from the heat of Jerusalem in the worst months of summer, when the sun pressed down on the city like a physical weight. Baldwin's daily life was, by any reasonable measure, relentlessly difficult. The disease required a medical regimen that, while medically ineffective by modern standards, was time-consuming and uncomfortable. The physicians prescribed baths, special preparations of herbs and minerals and other substances that were believed to have some effect on the skin manifestations of the disease. They prescribed dietary restrictions, bloodletting, the application of various salves and compounds to the affected skin. All of this had to be worked into the rhythms of a day that was already full of the demands of governance. Governance itself, for a medieval king, was an intensely physical activity in ways that we do not always appreciate from our distance. A king was expected to be visible, to receive petitioners in person, to sit in judgment, to appear at religious ceremonies, to be seen by his people as a living and present reality, rather than an abstract authority. For Baldwin, as the disease progressed and his body became more visibly affected, this visibility became increasingly complicated. The later medieval sources suggest that he attempted to manage his appearance carefully. The gloves became heavier and more concealing as the disease progressed, the face covering more complete, the ceremonial robes more carefully arranged to minimize the visibility of his condition. This was not vanity. This was a calculated management of symbolism in a world where the appearance of the king's body carried enormous political meaning. His closest relationships were primarily familial. His sister Sibylla was, by all accounts, genuinely devoted to her brother, and he to her. There is something quietly touching about the picture of these two royal siblings, both of them from the beginning aware of their extraordinary situation, both of them shaped by the same childhood in the Jerusalem court, both of them holding on to each other as the external pressures multiplied, navigating the impossible demands of their lives together. Sibylla would eventually become the central figure of the succession crisis, and her choices would be ones that Baldwin, in the end, could not fully support. But in the years before that crisis became fully acute, the relationship between the king and his sister appears to have been genuinely warm, one of the few places in Baldwin's constrained emotional life where something like uncomplicated affection was possible. His mother Agnes was more complicated. The court barons hated her. She had been excluded from proper recognition as Queen Mother, and her influence was resisted at every turn by the powerful lords who saw her as a disruptive force. But Baldwin maintained a relationship with her throughout his reign, allowed her a presence in his court, and seems to have drawn on her counsel in the way that any son might turn to a clever and experienced parent for guidance. Agnes was politically skilled in ways that were not always constructive. Her influence in the appointment of church officials, particularly the Patriarch Heraclius and the Archbishop of Caesarea, was seen by contemporaries and by later historians as self-interested and occasionally damaging. But she was also loyal to her son, and in a court where genuine loyalty was a precious and unreliable commodity, that counted for something. His relationships with the great knights and lords of his kingdom were shaped by a combination of personal respect and political calculation, the way all medieval royal relationships were. But some of them went beyond the transactional. His relationship with the Constable Humphrey II of Torron appears to have been genuinely warm. Humphrey was one of the great magnates of the kingdom, experienced and capable, and his loyalty to Baldwin was consistent and valuable. The relationship with Balian of Ibelin, the lord who would later become famous for his defence of Jerusalem in 1187, was another connection built on genuine respect. These men admired Baldwin, and not in the distant way that subjects admire a figurehead king. They admired him the way warriors admire someone who has fought alongside them and proved himself in the ways that fighters understand best. The question of marriage and succession must have cast a particular kind of shadow over Baldwin's personal life that is difficult to fully articulate. He was a king, and kings in the 12th century were expected to marry and produce heirs. This expectation was not merely social convention, it was the fundamental political logic of hereditary monarchy. But marriage for Baldwin was essentially impossible, for reasons that were both practical and ethical. No nobly born woman could reasonably be asked to marry him, not because of the stigma of leprosy alone, though that would have been considerable, but because of the near certainty that any marriage to Baldwin would produce no legitimate heirs, since the advanced state of his disease made the physical aspects of marriage impossible, and because the risk of transmission, however that was understood in his century, however the medical reality may have differed from the medieval belief, was one that no woman's family could reasonably be expected to accept. Baldwin did not marry. He could not marry. The love and intimacy that are among the most ordinary and precious dimensions of a human life were simply not available to him in the ways that they were available to other people. The palace at night. Let us imagine it for a moment. Not the formal, public areas where governance and ceremony happened, but the private spaces, the chambers where the king rested, where the physicians came and went, where the lights burned low and the official business of the day was done, and the long private hours of a man in pain stretched out ahead. These are the hours we cannot see directly in the historical record. These are the hours where Baldwin was simply himself, not the Leper King, not the military genius, not the political strategist, but a young man lying in the dark with a body that was slowly consuming itself, with a mind that knew what was coming, with a kingdom that needed him to keep holding on. He was devout. The religious dimension of medieval life was not merely formal or performative for most of the people who lived it. It was genuinely central, genuinely felt, a living framework that provided meaning and comfort, and a way of understanding even the most terrible things. Baldwin heard Mass regularly, maintained the religious observances appropriate to his position, and presumably drew on his faith in the way that people of genuine faith draw on it in times of extremity, as a source of meaning that can survive what reason and comfort cannot. We do not have his private prayers. We do not know what he said to God in those dark, quiet hours, but we can be fairly confident that he said something. We also know, and this is one of the most touching details in the historical record, that Baldwin continued to love horses throughout his life. This detail comes from William of Tyre, who records his pupil's early passion for riding, and it is confirmed by the military record. Baldwin rode in battle for years after his disease should, by any reasonable medical calculation, have made riding impossible. He rode with hands that could not properly feel the reins, with a body that was gradually losing its ability to maintain the physical coordination that horsemanship demands. He rode anyway. Perhaps the love of horses and the freedom of riding, the wind, the speed, the sense of powerful forward motion, was one of the things that remained to him as so much else was taken away. Perhaps it was one of the places where the disease's slow confiscation of sensation was matched, for a time, by the simple physical joy that riding provides regardless of sensation. Whatever the reason, the image of Baldwin on horseback, broken and brilliant, wrapped in his gloves and robes, riding at the head of his knights toward whatever the next crisis demanded, is one of the most compelling and most human images in the medieval record. The kingdom of Jerusalem was a feudal state, and feudal states were by their very nature arenas of competing ambitions, conflicting loyalties, and perpetual negotiation between the crown and the great lords who held land and owed military service, but also expected to have their opinions heard and their interests respected. This political reality would have been a challenge for any king. For a young king with a fatal disease, navigating these waters required an extraordinary combination of personal authority, political skill, and the ability to inspire loyalty in men who were capable of calculating exactly how long he was likely to live and what that meant for their own futures. The court factions of Baldwin's reign crystallized around several key figures and the fundamental question of succession. Since it was clear from fairly early in his reign that Baldwin would not produce direct heirs, the future of the kingdom depended on who his sister Sibylla would marry, and who the children of that marriage would be. Sibylla's first marriage, arranged before her brother's reign began, was to William of Montferrat, an Italian nobleman of distinguished lineage who arrived in the kingdom in 1176 with some fanfare and with the hopes of the court attached to him. He was, by all accounts, a capable man, but he barely had time to establish himself in the kingdom before he died, in the summer of 1177, of an illness that the sources describe with frustrating vagueness. He left Sibylla pregnant, and the child she bore, a boy named Baldwin after his royal uncle, became immediately one of the most important political figures in the kingdom, the heir presumptive whose future cast a long shadow over every political calculation. After William's death, the question of who Sibylla would marry next became the central political obsession of the Jerusalem court. Baldwin himself understood the importance of this decision and attempted to manage it, but managing it proved extraordinarily difficult because Sibylla had opinions of her own, strong opinions, and the will to act on them. She was her mother's daughter in this regard, as in others. She was not a woman who submitted quietly to the arrangements made for her by others. The man who eventually captured Sibylla's heart was Guy of Lusignan, a French nobleman from the Poitou region, handsome and charming in person, but, in the judgment of nearly every experienced political and military observer in the kingdom, fundamentally unsuited for the responsibilities he was being set up to inherit. Guy had arrived in the kingdom relatively recently, had quickly made himself conspicuous by his good looks and agreeable manner, and had somehow managed to attach himself to Sibylla's affections before the more experienced members of the court fully realized what was happening. Baldwin opposed the match. The powerful Ibelin family, who were the most influential of the baronial dynasties, opposed it with particular vigour. Baldwin of Ibelin had actually been a suitor for Sibylla's hand himself, and the speed with which Guy had eclipsed his own courtship was both personally offensive and politically alarming. But Sibylla married Guy anyway, in a move that was or was not sanctioned by Baldwin depending on which account you read. The sources disagree on exactly how the marriage came about, and the disagreement is itself revealing. It was not a situation anyone was comfortable with, and the lack of a clear, uncontested account of how it happened suggests a certain amount of collective face-saving at work in the chronicler's various versions. What is clear is that by 1180 Sibylla and Guy were married, that Guy had thereby become a major political figure in the kingdom, and that the marriage was deeply controversial. The problem with Guy was not merely personal, though his personality, characterised by chronicles as simultaneously overconfident and indecisive, was genuinely problematic. The deeper problem was that he represented a faction in the kingdom that believed in aggressive military engagement with Saladin, in the kind of bold, cavalry-forward thinking that might have been successful in an earlier period, but that made very little strategic sense given the current balance of forces. This faction, which included the energetic and reckless Reynald of Châtillon, as well as Gerard of Riedefort, the master of the Temple, had an almost adolescent faith in the invincibility of Crusader-mounted force, and a corresponding impatience with a careful, patient defensive strategy that more experienced heads counselled. Reynald of Châtillon deserves particular attention because he was in many ways the most disruptive single figure in the politics of Baldwin's reign. Reynald was an extraordinary character, a man of almost demonic energy and almost complete lack of moral scruple, possessed of a physical courage that contemporaries found impressive even as they were appalled by his methods. He had arrived in the Crusader East as a young knight of modest French origins, had made his way through a combination of charm, nerve, and opportunistic marriages to become one of the great lords of the kingdom. He had spent years as a prisoner of the Muslims after being captured in battle, and the years of captivity had done nothing to moderate his hostility or his recklessness. As the Lord of Transjordan, the region east of the Dead Sea, he occupied a strategically sensitive position that gave him enormous capacity for both legitimate military action and unauthorized provocation. Reynald used both capacities to the fullest. He launched piratical raids into the Red Sea in 1183, an audacious and infuriating act that threatened the Islamic holy cities of Mecca and Medina, and provided Saladin with exactly the kind of religiously charged outrage that could mobilize broader Muslim support for a campaign against the Crusaders. He repeatedly violated the truces that Baldwin had so carefully negotiated with Saladin, attacking caravans and Muslim travellers when the kingdom was supposedly at peace, creating crises that Baldwin then had to manage and sometimes pay for with political capital he could ill afford to spend. Baldwin was furious with Reynald and said so, but Reynald was a great lord, holder of strategically vital lands, not easily replaceable, and not the sort of man who submitted to royal correction with any grace. The tensions between the court factions, the Ibelins and their allies on one side, Guy and Reynald and the Templars on the other, were not merely personal rivalries, though they had personal dimensions. They reflected a genuine strategic disagreement about how the kingdom should position itself in the deteriorating external situation. Raymond of Tripoli, who oscillated between great influence and effective exile from the court, believed in negotiation, in diplomacy, in the careful management of relationships with Saladin as the only viable long-term strategy for kingdom survival. He was in this almost certainly correct. The opposing faction believed that aggression, boldness, and reliance on the military supremacy of the Crusader Knight would see the kingdom through. This was, as events would prove, almost certainly wrong. But it was a compelling belief for men who had grown up with stories of Montgisard and other Crusader victories, for men whose identity and honour were wrapped up in the tradition of mounted warfare and who found the idea of patient restraint somehow shameful. Baldwin spent enormous amounts of political energy trying to manage this division, trying to keep the factions from tearing the kingdom apart even as Saladin was pressing from the outside. He succeeded largely for most of his reign. He revoked Guy's regency in 1183 after the failure at the Springs of Sapphira. He attempted to arrange Sibylla's divorce from Guy, a remarkably bold move, essentially trying to force his own sister to end her marriage to a man she loved, because he had concluded that Guy's rule would be catastrophically bad for the kingdom. Sibylla refused. The love between Sibylla and Guy was genuine, and Sibylla would not sacrifice it for her brother's political calculations, however well-founded those calculations might be. There was also the question of the Patriarch of Jerusalem, Heraclius, whose appointment Baldwin's mother Agnes had supported, and whose character was, by essentially universal agreement, deeply unsuitable for his position. Heraclius was worldly, interested in power and comfort, notoriously involved with the wife of a nameless merchant in a relationship so public that it had become a scandal that even Saladin's sources recorded with some amusement. He was not the spiritual leader the kingdom needed in a time of crisis, and his presence at the head of the church created a running undercurrent of embarrassment and dysfunction in the kingdom's religious life. Baldwin tolerated him because removing him would have caused a constitutional crisis, and because he needed to preserve his political capital for the external threat. But the toleration was not comfortable, and the Patriarch's inadequacy was one more weight on a very heavily loaded situation. William of Tyre, Baldwin's beloved tutor, the man who had discovered his leprosy, who had watched him grow from a quick, promising student into an extraordinary king, fell out of favour in the early 1180s. The exact reasons are debated by historians, but the general picture seems to involve William's opposition to Agnes's influence and to the appointment of Heraclius, combined with the factional pressures of the court that made his position increasingly difficult. William left the kingdom for Europe in 1183 and never returned. He died in 1186, shortly before the catastrophe that he had seen coming and that Baldwin had spent his entire reign trying to prevent. His chronicle, which he had been compiling throughout his years at the Jerusalem court, remains as it was when he set it down, a monument to his learning and his grief, a loving record of a world he knew was in danger of being destroyed. Baldwin knew by 1183, or certainly by 1184, that he was dying. The disease had progressed beyond any reasonable hope of stabilization. He was blind, or nearly so. He could not walk. He could not hold a pen. The kingdom was politically fractured, with the succession crisis unresolved, and his best strategic judgment being consistently frustrated by the faction that had attached itself to Guy and to the aggressive approach. He had his nephew Baldwin V crowned, a child who was himself sickly and who would die in 1186, barely 2 years after his coronation. He had done everything he could think of to secure the kingdom's future. It was not enough. He knew it was not enough, but he did not stop. He died in the spring of 1185. He was 23 years old. He had been king for 11 years, 11 years of extraordinary difficulty, 11 years of pain and political crisis and military challenge and personal loss. In those 11 years, he had defeated Saladin in open battle. He had held the kingdom together through forces that were simultaneously trying to tear it apart from within and destroy it from without. He had governed with a combination of intelligence and courage and stubborn, enduring will that would have been remarkable in a healthy man of 40, and that in a diseased young man of his circumstances was simply without parallel. The kingdom of Jerusalem in context. To truly understand Baldwin IV, we need to understand the extraordinary and unusual civilization that surrounded him, the Crusader states in their full complexity, their full paradox, their full humanity. These were not simply military outposts of European colonialism, though they were that too. They were something that had not existed before and would not exist again. A society formed in the collision of multiple civilizations, under existential pressure from its first day to its last, generating a culture and a way of life that blended elements of its constituent parts into something genuinely hybrid and genuinely fascinating. The four Crusader states, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Edessa, though Edessa had fallen before Baldwin's birth, were distinct political entities with distinct cultures and distinct relationships to the larger Islamic world that surrounded them. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was the most southerly, and in many ways the most symbolically charged, given its possession of the Holy City. Its capital was Jerusalem itself, but its economic heart was Acre, and its maritime connection to Europe ran through a string of coastal cities, Jaffa, Caesarea, Haifa, Beirut, that were among the busiest ports in the Mediterranean world. The people of the Crusader kingdom were themselves a remarkable mixture. The original crusading settlers, the Franks as they were collectively called regardless of their actual national origin, formed the ruling class, the great noble families who held the fiefs and commanded the military forces. But they were a numerical minority in the lands they ruled. The majority of the population was made up of indigenous Christians, Greek Orthodox, Armenian, Maronite, Coptic, Syriac, as well as Muslims and Jews, all of whom continued to live their lives under Crusader rule with varying degrees of accommodation and resistance. The indigenous Christians were generally the group with whom the Franks had the most interaction, and there was a gradual process of cultural osmosis that moved in both directions. The Franks adopting local customs, dress, food, and medical knowledge, the local Christians adapting to the administrative and legal framework of Frankish rule. The Muslims who lived within the kingdom occupied a more complex position. In the cities they were a minority, their presence generally tolerated as long as they paid the appropriate taxes and caused no disturbance. In the rural areas, particularly in the agricultural regions, they were more numerous, forming the majority of the peasant workforce that cultivated the kingdom's fields and orchards and vineyards. The relationship between these communities and their Frankish lords was not one of equality. It was manifestly not one of equality, but it was often one of a kind of working coexistence that surprised visitors from Europe, who sometimes found the social arrangements of the Crusader kingdom disturbingly relaxed about the proximity of Christians and Muslims. Saladin, the other side of the story. No account of Baldwin IV is complete without a fuller account of the man on the other side, the man whose extraordinary rise to power shaped the entire context of Baldwin's reign, and whose eventual triumph over the kingdom, 4 years after Baldwin's death, represents the hinge point of Crusader history. Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, Saladin, was born around 1137 in Tikrit, in what is now Iraq, the son of Ayyub ibn Shadi, a Kurdish military commander in the service of the Zengid dynasty of Mosul. His family was part of the military aristocracy of the Islamic world, professional soldiers with connections to the great powers of the age, and Saladin grew up in an environment that combined martial training with genuine intellectual culture. His rise to prominence was rapid and not entirely conventional. He entered the service of Nur ad-Din, the great Zengid ruler who was in the process of unifying the Islamic territories to the north and east of the Crusader kingdom, and was sent to Egypt as part of a military force sent to prevent the Crusaders from taking advantage of the political instability of the Fatimid Caliphate. He proved himself a brilliant administrator and politician, as well as a skilled military commander, and by 1171 he had effectively taken control of Egypt, abolishing the Fatimid Caliphate and establishing his own power on a Sunni basis. When Nur ad-Din died in 1174, the same year as Baldwin's father Amalric, Saladin moved quickly to extend his control over Syria and the surrounding territories, presenting himself as the champion of Sunni Islam and the liberator of Jerusalem. The project of liberating Jerusalem, Al-Quds, the Holy, as it was known in Arabic, was not merely a political slogan for Saladin. He was genuinely devout, and the recovery of the third holiest site in Islam appears to have been a genuine personal commitment as well as a strategic objective. But it was also a source of enormous legitimacy. The leader who could claim to have retaken Jerusalem from the Crusaders would have a claim on Muslim devotion and political loyalty that no mere military achievement could match. Saladin understood this, and it shaped his strategy for the 2 decades that preceded the actual recapture of the city. The Saladin who faced Baldwin IV was a man of genuine complexity. He could be generous to a fault. The Islamic and even some Crusader sources record numerous instances of personal magnanimity that were not merely calculated but seemed to reflect a genuine temperament. He released prisoners when he could have enslaved them. He respected the courage of enemies who had earned it. He maintained a reputation for personal honesty that was unusual in the intensely political world he operated in. He was also, when he needed to be, ruthless, capable of the hard decisions that holding power in the medieval world required. He was deeply conscious of his own image, both in his lifetime and for posterity, and he had court chroniclers who were charged with recording his deeds in the most favourable possible light. We read him, even now, partly through their eyes. His response to Baldwin's reign was, for most of that reign, one of strategic patience. He was building, adding territory, consolidating control, expanding the economic base that would support the military campaigns he was planning. He didn't want to commit to a full-scale invasion of the Crusader kingdom until he was sure he could finish the job. The experience of Montgisard, of having an enormous army routed by a small force of determined cavalry under a sick teenager, was a lesson he absorbed seriously. He would not repeat it. He would wait until the conditions were right, until the kingdom's internal weaknesses had been sufficiently exposed, until he had a force that could not only defeat the Crusader field army, but take and hold the cities afterward. He also, during Baldwin's reign, respected the king himself in a way that complicated his strategic calculations. Saladin was not the sort of man who dismissed an enemy he had seen fight. Baldwin had demonstrated at Montgisard that the Crusader kingdom under his leadership was capable of genuine military excellence. Saladin responded with a combination of military pressure and diplomatic manoeuvring, probing for weaknesses while maintaining a posture of formal negotiation, looking for the moment when Baldwin's illness would incapacitate him sufficiently that the kingdom's leadership would fall into weaker hands. He found that moment after Baldwin's death. When Baldwin V died in 1186 and the succession crisis came to a head, the result, Sibylla and Guy becoming the ruling couple of Jerusalem, was precisely what Saladin needed. Guy of Lusignan was not Baldwin IV, and the events of 1187 would prove it in the most catastrophic way imaginable. The medical world of the 12th century, leprosy, healers, and the St. Lazarus tradition, the medical knowledge of the 12th century was, by modern standards, vastly insufficient, a mixture of genuine observation and careful empiricism with theoretical frameworks that could not fully explain what they were observing and treatments that could not effectively address what they were treating. And yet, it was not nothing. The physicians of the Crusader kingdom had access to the best medical knowledge of their age, which meant access to the Arabic medical tradition that had preserved, expanded upon, and in some cases significantly improved the classical Greek and Roman medical inheritance. The Arabic medical tradition in the 12th century was, by any fair measure, the most sophisticated medical tradition in the world. Physicians like Ibn Sina, known in Europe as Avicenna, had produced encyclopedic works that synthesized everything known about medicine in their time and organised it with a rigorous clarity that made it not merely a reference collection, but an actual system of medical understanding. Ibn Sina's Canon of Medicine would remain a standard medical textbook in European universities for centuries, a testament to the depth and coherence of the Arabic medical tradition's achievements. For leprosy specifically, the Arabic medical tradition offered a fairly detailed description of the disease's progression, its characteristic signs, and its differential diagnosis from other skin conditions. The physicians could identify leprosy with reasonable accuracy. The combination of skin changes, loss of sensation, and progressive physical signs was recognizable to trained observers. What they could not do was cure it, because the cure required an antibiotic that would not exist for another 8 centuries. The treatments prescribed for leprosy in the 12th century were drawn from the pharmacological traditions of multiple cultures, filtered through the theoretical framework of humoral medicine. Dietary restriction was commonly recommended. Certain foods were believed to exacerbate the imbalance of humours that caused the disease, and eliminating them was thought to slow its progression. Various herbal preparations were prescribed both internally and topically. Preparations involving theriac, the great compound antidote inherited from antiquity, sulphur compounds, various plant extracts with antimicrobial properties that we can now recognise in hindsight as not entirely without some marginal effect on the skin manifestations of the disease. Bathing in specially prepared waters, including the waters of certain mineral springs believed to have therapeutic properties, bloodletting, the near-universal medieval response to any condition involving perceived imbalance of the humours. None of these treatments could stop leprosy, but they were provided and received, and the ritual of treatment had its own value regardless of its medical efficacy, the value of being tended to, of being the object of professional care and attention, of having the terrible inward logic of the disease interrupted by the social and ritual structure of the medical encounter. Baldwin received the best medical care available to any person of his time. It was not enough. It was never going to be enough, but it was not nothing. The Order of St. Lazarus occupied a special and touching place in the world of Baldwin's Jerusalem. Founded in the early 12th century, initially as a hospital specifically for lepers outside the walls of Jerusalem, the order had gradually evolved into a military organisation, one of the unique products of the crusading world, where the imperatives of care and combat existed in such close proximity that they sometimes merged. By the time of Baldwin's reign, the Order of St. Lazarus accepted members who were themselves lepers, knights who had contracted the disease but retained sufficient physical capacity to serve in a military role. This was deeply unusual in the medieval world, where lepers were typically excluded from military service. The Order of St. Lazarus offered them a community, a purpose, and a continuing role in the defence of the kingdom they had sworn to protect. There is something profoundly moving about this. A brotherhood of sick men fighting for a city whose possession meant everything to their faith, finding in their shared affliction not a reason for despair, but a bond of solidarity and purpose. Baldwin, as the Leper King himself, had a particular relationship with the Order of St. Lazarus that went beyond the merely official. These were men who understood, from the inside, what it meant to live in a body that was betraying you while the demands of the world continued undiminished. They shared with him something that no one who had not experienced the disease could fully understand. The military orders, Templars, Hospitallers, and their role in Baldwin's kingdom. The military orders were among the most distinctive and important institutions of the Crusader kingdom, and their role in Baldwin's reign was complex and sometimes problematic. The Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller were international organisations with resources and manpower that the kingdom's crown could not match. They held enormous fortifications, maintained permanent standing forces of trained knights, and operated outside the normal feudal hierarchy in ways that gave them both extraordinary power and a certain structural immunity to royal control. The Templars in particular were a source of persistent tension during Baldwin's reign. Gerard of Ridefort, who became Master of the Temple in 1185, was a man whose relationship with the hawkish faction around Guy of Lusignan made him a consistent adversary of the more diplomatically oriented approach that Baldwin favoured. Gerard had a personal grievance against the Ibelin family. He had been promised, and then denied, the hand of a wealthy heiress in marriage, a slight that he apparently never forgave, and that coloured his political relationships for the rest of his life with a bitterness that sometimes overrode strategic common sense. The Hospitallers, by contrast, were generally more aligned with the moderate faction during this period, and their role in the care of the sick gave them a particular institutional sympathy with the king's situation that had some bearing on the kingdom's medical infrastructure. The Great Hospital in Jerusalem, the Order's mother house, was among the best medical facilities in the 12th century world, capable of treating hundreds of patients simultaneously, staffed by trained physicians and apothecaries, maintained with resources that reflected the Order's substantial wealth. Baldwin would have had access to the Order's medical knowledge and presumably to its physicians when needed. The complex relationship between the Crown and the military orders was one of the persistent structural challenges of the Crusader kingdom throughout its history. The Order's independence from royal authority, their direct accountability to the Pope rather than to any secular lord, meant that a king could not command them as he commanded his feudal vassals. He could request their cooperation, could offer them material incentives for it, could appeal to their institutional interest in the kingdom's survival. But he could not compel them. And in a kingdom where the military forces were already desperately thin, the ability to count on the Order's cooperation in any given crisis was never fully secure. The Pilgrims, Jerusalem as the centre of faith throughout Baldwin's reign, throughout the entire period of the Crusader kingdom, amidst all its wars and political crises and structural anxieties, Jerusalem continued to draw pilgrims. This unceasing human tide of faith and hope and devotion was in many ways the kingdom's most fundamental reason for being, the spiritual purpose that justified all the violence and sacrifice that its existence required. Pilgrims came from everywhere in the Christian world, from France and England and the German lands, from Scandinavia and Hungary and Poland, from the Eastern Christian world of Byzantium and Armenia and Georgia. They came in groups and individually, rich and poor, healthy and ill, young and old. They came to walk where Jesus walked, to see the church of the Holy Sepulchre, to touch the stones of the places where, they believed, the most important story in human history had unfolded. For many of these pilgrims, the journey itself was a form of penance, a demanding physical undertaking that was understood as an outward expression of inward transformation, a body-length prayer made of miles and hardship and danger. The sea voyage from European ports to the ports of the Crusader kingdom was genuinely hazardous. Storms, pirates and disease claimed pilgrims every year. The overland routes were even more dangerous, and yet they came, year after year, in numbers that modern historians have estimated in the tens of thousands annually in the most active periods. The kingdom's economy depended significantly on this traffic, on the fees charged for lodging and transport, on the sale of sacred relics and objects, on the hospitality industry that grew up to serve the pilgrims' needs. For Baldwin, the pilgrims represented something important beyond the economic. They were the living expression of why the kingdom existed, the human embodiment of the cause he was sacrificing himself to preserve. When he rode through Jerusalem in formal procession, when he attended Mass at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, when he appeared in the formal ceremonies of the kingdom's religious calendar, he was doing so in front of pilgrims from all over the Christian world who'd come to see Jerusalem and who, seeing the King of Jerusalem, were seeing the human representative of the kingdom's sacred purpose. The visibility of his illness, visible even through the gloves and robes that attempted to minimize it, was for many pilgrims not a disqualification, but something more like a confirmation. Here was a man marked by suffering, marked by the kind of mortal vulnerability that resonated with the suffering God they had come to venerate. The Byzantine factor, Constantinople's shadow over the kingdom. The Crusader kingdom did not exist in isolation from the great powers of its age. To the north, the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire in its long attenuated twilight, remained a significant factor in the politics of the Crusader states, a power that the Crusaders alternately courted and resented, that occasionally provided military support and more frequently provided diplomatic complications. The Byzantine Emperor Manuel I Komnenos had been an active presence in the affairs of the Crusader states during the period before Baldwin's reign, and his death in 1180, in the same year as Baldwin's father-in-law Raymond of Antioch, removed a stabilizing influence from the regional balance of power. The relationship between the Kingdom of Jerusalem and Byzantium had always been a complicated one. The Crusaders had theoretically come to the east in part to help the Byzantines recover territory lost to the Seljuk Turks. This had been part of the original justification for the First Crusade, the appeal from Byzantine Emperor Alexios I to Pope Urban II that had helped set the whole enterprise in motion. In practice, the Crusader states had established their independence from Byzantine authority almost immediately, and had frequently been in conflict with Constantinople over territorial questions, ecclesiastical jurisdiction, and the fundamental question of whether the Latin Church or the Greek Church had authority over the Christian communities of the Holy Land. By Baldwin's time, the Byzantine connection was more latent than active, a background factor rather than a daily reality, but it shaped the political calculations of the kingdom in ways that were real, if not always visible. The Crusader lords were aware that Constantinople might, under the right conditions, be an ally. They were also aware that Byzantine interests did not always align with their own, and that depending on Constantinople was a complicated bet. The fate of Baldwin V and the succession crisis. When Baldwin IV died in the spring of 1185, the throne passed to his nephew Baldwin V, Sibylla's son by her first husband William of Montferrat, who was at the time approximately 5 or 6 years old. Raymond III of Tripoli was named regent, a choice that reflected the ongoing struggle between the factions and the recognition that a child on the throne needed an experienced and capable adult to manage the kingdom's affairs. Raymond was the right choice in many respects. He was intelligent, he had deep experience, and he was broadly aligned with the diplomatic, moderate approach that Baldwin IV had pursued. But he was also deeply unpopular with the Orcish faction, and his regency was bitterly contested from the beginning. Baldwin V was a sickly child. He'd been unwell even before his coronation as co-king, and whatever the nature of his illness, the source is not specific, it progressed quickly after he became sole king. He died in the summer of 1186, barely a year after his uncle, still a child. His death triggered the succession crisis that Baldwin IV had spent years trying to prevent or at least manage. The question of who would rule the kingdom now passed definitively to Sibylla and her husband Guy. Sibylla became queen. Guy became, through her, king. The great lords who had opposed them, Raymond of Tripoli, the Ibelins, the entire moderate faction, found themselves outmaneuvered by a combination of the aggressive faction's quick action and Sibylla's own determination to remain with her husband. There was a brief attempt to offer Sibylla the crown on condition that she annul her marriage to Guy. She accepted the crown, and then, exercising her queenly prerogative, immediately regranted Guy's hand in marriage to himself, the same husband she had supposedly agreed to leave. It was an act of political theatre that infuriated her opponents, and demonstrated, if nothing else, that she shared her brother's determination when her will was set. The political crisis that followed was severe. Raymond of Tripoli, humiliated and furious, actually opened negotiations with Saladin, a move that was treasonous in the most literal sense, but that reflected the depth of his conviction that Guy's rule would be catastrophic for the kingdom. He seems to have believed that a temporary accommodation with Saladin was less dangerous than the kind of reckless militarism that Guy and Reynold represented. He was, as subsequent events would prove, right about the danger, but his means of addressing it were ones that would damage his reputation irreparably. The Battle of Hattin, the kingdom's catastrophe. The Battle of the Horns of Hattin, fought on the 4th of July 1187, is one of the most significant and most devastating military disasters in the history of the Crusader kingdom. It is the battle that ended the Kingdom of Jerusalem as a functioning Crusader state, that destroyed the field army on which the kingdom's defence depended and opened the way to Saladin's recapture of Jerusalem and most of the other major cities of the kingdom. The battle was, in a terrible sense, the fulfilment of everything that Baldwin IV had worked so hard to prevent. Saladin invaded in force in the summer of 1187, and Guy, now the king, the man Baldwin had spent so much political capital trying to remove from the succession, made precisely the kind of decision that strategic experience should have told him to avoid. He marched the Crusader army away from its water supply at the springs of Safaria, through the waterless plateau toward Tiberias, following a road that Saladin had effectively chosen for him by threatening the Count of Tripoli's city. The Crusader force, the full combined army of the kingdom, every knight who could be assembled, the true cross itself carried as a talisman into battle, marched through the July heat without water, harassed by Saladin's cavalry, losing cohesion with every hour. They were surrounded at the Horns of Hattin, a distinctive double-peaked hill near the Sea of Galilee, and destroyed. The army was annihilated, the true cross was captured, the king himself was taken prisoner. Reynald of Châtillon was captured and personally executed by Saladin, who had sworn to kill him for his crimes. Raymond of Tripoli managed to escape with a portion of his cavalry, but died a few months later, possibly of pleurisy, possibly of the kind of illness that comes when a man's spirit breaks. The kingdom of Jerusalem had no field army left. Jerusalem fell to Saladin in October 1187. Unlike the Christian conquest of 1099, which had been accompanied by a massacre, Saladin's reconquest was notable for its relative restraint. The population was allowed to ransom themselves to freedom, and those who could not pay were enslaved rather than killed. The contrast between the two conquests was noted by contemporaries on both sides, and it contributed to Saladin's enduring reputation as a man of unusual chivalric virtue. Baldwin IV had died 2 years before. He had not lived to see the catastrophe. But one wonders, in those final months of his life, whether he saw it coming, whether the intelligence that had made him such an effective king could also read the trajectory clearly enough to know that what he was leaving behind was not stable enough to survive the tests that were coming. He had tried. He had tried with everything he had, and for the years of his reign, it had been enough. After him, it was not. The Third Crusade. The world responds. The fall of Jerusalem sent shockwaves through the Christian world. Pope Gregory VIII issued the papal bull Audita Tremendi, attributing the disaster to the sins of the Crusaders and calling for a new crusade to recover the Holy City. The response was enormous. 3 of the most powerful monarchs of the age, Frederick I Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire, Philip II of France, and Richard I of England, took the cross and began preparing their forces for a new campaign in the East. The Third Crusade, which began arriving in the Holy Land in 1189, was in many ways the most spectacular military expedition of the crusading period. Richard I of England, Richard Coeur de Lion, Richard the Lionheart, brought with him a military reputation that was, and remains, almost without peer in the medieval world. He was a man of extraordinary personal courage, brilliant tactical instincts, and enormous energy, possessed of a physical presence and personal magnetism that inspired fierce loyalty in his followers. He would achieve significant military successes against Saladin. The Battle of Arsuf in 1191 was a brilliant demonstration of disciplined crusader tactics, but he could not ultimately recapture Jerusalem. He came close, within sight of the city on one famous occasion, when he reportedly covered his eyes rather than look at a city he'd been unable to take. But the strategic realities that had made the kingdom's survival so difficult in Baldwin's time had not fundamentally changed, and Richard's political situation in Europe required him to negotiate rather than continue fighting indefinitely. The Treaty of Jaffa, concluded in 1192, left Jerusalem in Muslim hands, but allowed Christian pilgrims access to the Holy City, a compromise that satisfied no one entirely and solved nothing permanently, but that at least allowed the Crusader presence in the Holy Land to continue, in reduced and altered form for another century. Medical knowledge travelling between cultures, one of the most fascinating and least appreciated dimensions of the Crusader kingdom's world, was the transfer of medical knowledge between the Islamic and Christian medical traditions. The physicians of the Crusader kingdom lived at the intersection of multiple medical traditions, the Latin tradition inherited from classical antiquity through Byzantium and the European monastic schools, the Arabic tradition preserved and expanded through the great work of scholars like Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd, and the practical empirical knowledge accumulated by the local physicians who had been treating the diseases of this particular climate and region for generations. This medical pluralism was, in practice, a source of significant advantage. Crusader physicians had access to Arabic medical texts that contained knowledge not available in the Latin tradition, and they appear to have made use of it. There is documented evidence of Crusader lords and even ecclesiastical figures consulting Muslim physicians. The great Frankish Lord Fulk of Anjou, King of Jerusalem in an earlier generation, was treated by a Muslim physician, as was the famous historian Usama ibn Munkid, who recorded his observations of Frankish medicine with a mixture of admiration and horror that gives us an invaluable outside perspective on medical practice in the Crusader world. Usama's account of Frankish medicine is particularly interesting for what it reveals about the encounter between different medical traditions in the Holy Land. He describes cases where Frankish physicians applied brutal treatments, amputations, cauterizations, where Muslim physicians would have attempted more conservative approaches, and vice versa. He also describes cases where Muslim patients were cured by Frankish physicians and Frankish patients by Muslim ones, suggesting that the actual practice was more pragmatic and cross-cultural than the official boundaries between communities might suggest. People who were suffering were often willing to accept help from whoever offered it, regardless of their faith or cultural background. A human truth that has always existed alongside, and sometimes in tension, with the ideological commitments that formal culture enforces. The children of Jerusalem, growing up in the kingdom. The Crusader kingdom was not merely the world of kings and great lords and military confrontations. It was also the world of ordinary people, of the children who grew up speaking the strange hybrid language of the Levantine Franks, who played in the narrow streets of Jerusalem and Acre and Tyre, who grew up knowing both the Arabic call to prayer and the Latin Mass, who ate the foods of multiple cultures and absorbed, in that unreflective way that children absorb the world they're born into, the extraordinary complexity of the civilization that surrounded them. These children, the native-born crusaders, called poulains, a word that carried the slight condescension of newcomers from Europe, who found them suspiciously assimilated to local ways, were genuinely something new under the sun. They were neither European nor Eastern in the full sense of either term. They were Levantine, Mediterranean, a product of the encounter. They grew up taking for granted a degree of cultural mixing that would have seemed deeply exotic to their grandparents who had come from France or Burgundy or Normandy. They negotiated with the tradesmen of Damascus and played with the children of Armenian craftsmen and learned their medical knowledge from Jewish physicians and their agricultural techniques from the peasant communities who had been farming this land since long before any crusader arrived. This cultural mixing was one of the things that visitors from Europe sometimes found disturbing about the Crusader states. A new arrival from France would find that the great lords of the kingdom had adopted Eastern customs of dress and bathing, and diet that seemed, to European eyes, disturbingly close to going native. The Frankish lords wore silk robes, they reclined on cushions, they ate the foods of the country rather than the heavy meat and grain diet of northern Europe. They hired Muslim and Jewish physicians. They built their castles and churches in styles that blended Western and Eastern architectural traditions. They were, in a word, adapted to a specific place and a specific way of life that was not quite anything the world had seen before. The women of the kingdom, Sibylla, Maria Komnena, and the power of queens. The women of the Crusader kingdom occupied a political space that was, by the standards of medieval Europe, unusually significant. The practical necessities of the kingdom, the frequent absences of men on campaign, the high mortality of the military class, the need for capable administrators in the absence of the lords, had created a tradition of female governance that went beyond the merely ceremonial. Women in the Crusader kingdom could inherit fiefs, could govern them, could in some circumstances command military forces. The Queen of Jerusalem was not merely a decorative appendage to the throne, she was a significant political actor in her own right, as Sibylla's career amply demonstrated. Maria Komnena, Baldwin's stepmother, his father Amalric's second wife, the Byzantine princess whom Amalric had married after his annulment from Agnes of Courtenay, was another striking example of the kind of female political intelligence the kingdom generated and required. After Amalric's death, Maria had married Balian of Ibelin, the great lord who would defend Jerusalem in 1187. She brought to this second marriage a formidable combination of Byzantine court education and practical Crusader political experience, and she remained a significant figure in the kingdom's affairs throughout the period we're examining. The contrast between the two women at the centre of Baldwin's personal world, Agnes his mother and Maria his stepmother, reflects the factional divisions of the court with almost diagrammatic clarity. Agnes was aligned with the hawkish faction, with Heraclius and Guy and the aggressive approach. Maria, through her Ibelin husband, was firmly in the moderate camp. Baldwin navigated between them with the same careful skill he brought to all his political relationships, acknowledging both, satisfying neither entirely, managing the tensions without allowing them to become destructive. The fortress architecture of the kingdom, stones of power. No account of the Crusader kingdom is complete without some attention to its architecture, and specifically to its military architecture, the extraordinary castles and fortifications that were the physical embodiment of the kingdom's determination to hold its ground against the forces pressing on it from every direction. These structures were among the most sophisticated military engineering achievements of the medieval world, and they were built and maintained throughout the period of Baldwin's reign as the kingdom's most reliable long-term defence. The great Crusader castles were not merely military installations. They were economic centres, administrative hubs, symbols of lordly power and sometimes genuine works of architectural beauty. Kerach of Moab, the castle of Reynald of Châtillon in the Transjordan, stood on a volcanic plateau overlooking the Dead Sea and the surrounding desert, with an air of absolute dominance. A massive multi-towered fortification that could shelter an entire community and could withstand a siege of months. The Crac des Chevaliers in the county of Tripoli was perhaps the most impressive of all. a concentric fortress of extraordinary complexity, capable of sheltering a garrison of 2,000, with cisterns that could provide water for years of siege, granaries, stables, a chapel, accommodation for the knights and their horses and their servants. A complete world enclosed in stone, capable of outlasting almost any army that came against it. The fortress of Jacob's Ford, Chastelet as the Crusaders called it, that Saladin captured and destroyed in 1179 was one of Baldwin's most ambitious military construction projects, a new stronghold on the Jordan River intended to constrain Saladin's movements and provide a base for operations into the territories to the east. Its construction was expensive and controversial, requiring significant investment from the kingdom's treasury and provoking Saladin to respond with offers of money to stop the work, offers Baldwin refused. When Saladin captured it, the destruction was thorough and deliberate. He dismantled the walls and filled in the ditches, ensuring it could not be rebuilt easily. The loss was a genuine strategic setback, and it illustrated the perpetual competition between Crusader fortress building and Saladin's determination to prevent the construction of new positions that would constrain his freedom of action. Trade, commerce, and the economy of the kingdom. The Crusader kingdom was not merely a military enterprise or a religious project. It was also a commercial economy of significant sophistication, embedded in the broader trading networks of the medieval Mediterranean. Acre, the kingdom's great port city, was one of the busiest commercial centres in the 12th century world, a meeting point of the trade routes that carried goods from the Indian Ocean and the Silk Road through the Levantine ports to the markets of Europe. The Italian maritime republics, Venice, Genoa, Pisa, had established trading colonies in Acre and the other Crusader ports, and their ships maintained a constant traffic of goods, pilgrims, and occasionally soldiers between the Levant and the West. The goods that flowed through the Crusader ports were among the most valuable in the world. Spices from the Far East, silk from China and Persia, sugar from the plantations that the Crusaders had established in the coastal plain, glass and metalwork from Syrian craftsmen, textiles, dyes, and 100 other products that found eager markets in Europe. The customs revenues from this trade were a significant part of the kingdom's financial resources and the management of trade relationships with the Italian city-states, with the Muslim merchants who were major participants in the Levantine commercial network, with the indigenous merchant communities of the kingdom, was a constant preoccupation of the royal administration. Baldwin's reign was not a time of great commercial expansion. The external military pressure and the internal political tensions created an environment that was not conducive to the peaceful development of trade. But the commercial machinery of the kingdom continued to function throughout his reign, and the customs revenues of Acre continued to provide the financial base without which the military enterprise could not have been sustained. The relationship between the Italian trading communities and the crown was one of the most important and most complex in the kingdom's political life. The Italians were essential to the kingdom's survival. They knew it, and they extracted significant concessions in return for their cooperation. The Church in Jerusalem, faith, power, and corruption. The Latin Church in the Crusader kingdom occupied a position of enormous importance and perpetual controversy. The kingdom was, in theory, a sacred enterprise, a Christian state established to protect the holy places and ensure Christian access to them. The Church was therefore not merely a religious institution, but the ideological legitimizing principle of the entire Crusader project. The Patriarch of Jerusalem, the Archbishop of Tyre, the bishops of the various dioceses, the abbots of the great monasteries, the masters of the military orders, all of these figures were part of the kingdom's governing class as well as its religious leadership, and their political role could not be separated from their ecclesiastical one. The Patriarch Heraclius, whose appointment Agnes of Courtenay had supported, and whose character was so deeply unsuitable for his position, was a genuine institutional problem for the kingdom during the later years of Baldwin's reign. He was not merely personally scandalous, though he was that, and the chronicles record his relationship with the merchant's wife Pascia of Riveri, with a specificity that suggests the gossip was widely circulated and broadly believed. He was also politically unreliable, aligned with factions rather than with the kingdom's long-term interests, and temperamentally inclined toward personal comfort over public duty. When the great lords of Christendom were being sought as leaders for a new crusade, when Heraclius travelled to Europe in 1184 to 1185 to appeal to Henry II of England to come to the kingdom's aid, his failure to convince the English king to commit was partly a result of the geopolitical situation, and partly, one suspects, a result of the particular impression the patriarch himself made on the shrewd English court. The contrast between Heraclius and William of Tyre, the learned, devoted, historically minded archbishop who had been Baldwin's tutor and who had devoted his life to understanding and recording the kingdom he loved, is almost too stark to be coincidental. It feels, reading the history of the period, like a parable about what the kingdom was choosing in its leadership during those critical years, about the difference between institutional health and institutional rot, about the costs of allowing personal and factional interest to determine who holds positions of public responsibility. How Baldwin's legend grew, history's response to a remarkable life. In the centuries after his death, Baldwin IV was not widely celebrated. He was remembered in the chronicles. William of Tyre's account ensured that, and the later historians who built on William's work preserved the essential outlines of his story. But he was remembered primarily as a tragic figure, as the sick young king whose extraordinary qualities could not ultimately prevent the disaster that followed his reign. The celebration of his military achievements was overshadowed by the larger catastrophe of Hattin and the fall of Jerusalem, and the emotional weight of that catastrophe coloured every retrospective account of the period leading up to it. The rehabilitation of Baldwin's reputation, the recognition of just how remarkable his achievements were given his circumstances, is largely a product of modern historical scholarship. The 20th century brought a new wave of detailed historical work on the Crusader kingdom that looked at the primary sources with fresh eyes and increasingly sophisticated analytical tools, and this work consistently arrived at the same conclusion, that Baldwin IV was one of the most extraordinary rulers of the medieval period, that his achievements during his reign were genuinely remarkable, and that the disaster of 1187 was not the consequence of his failures, but of the failures of those who came after him. The popular imagination found him again in the 21st century, partly through the medium of cinema. Ridley Scott's film, Kingdom of Heaven, released in 2005, brought the story of the Crusader kingdom and the figure of the Leper King to a large global audience. The film's depiction of Baldwin, masked, clearly suffering, yet possessing a quiet dignity and moral clarity that stood in stark contrast to the ambitions and failures of those around him, captured something real about the historical figure, even if the film's overall approach to historical accuracy was variable. The Baldwin of Kingdom of Heaven, played memorably by Edward Norton, entirely masked, communicating entirely through posture and voice, became for many viewers their first encounter with one of medieval history's most compelling figures. This popular rediscovery has been, on balance, a good thing. Baldwin deserves to be known. His story is genuinely extraordinary, genuinely instructive, and genuinely moving, and the fact that he lived and ruled in a time and place that is not always familiar to general readers should not prevent his story from being told and heard. The legacy of the Crusader kingdom. What it meant, what it left. The Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem lasted in one form or another for nearly 2 centuries. It was founded in 1099, its primary territory was lost in 1187, it was partially restored by the Third Crusade and subsequent negotiations, it lingered in reduced form centred on Acre until 1291 when the last Crusader city fell to the Mamluk Sultanate, and even then a nominal kingdom of Jerusalem continued to be claimed by European monarchs for centuries afterward. A ghostly legacy of title and pretension that outlasted the physical reality by hundreds of years. What did it leave behind? The question is genuinely complicated, and the answers depend on which dimensions of the legacy you are examining. The physical legacy includes the extraordinary castles and fortifications that still stand in the Levant, the Crac des Chevaliers, Carac, Montfort, the tower in the old city of Acre, the churches that survive as mosques or in other adapted forms. These are stones that tell stories, that encode in their construction the labour and skill and determination of a civilization that is gone. The cultural legacy includes the complicated, fascinating process of cultural exchange and synthesis that the kingdom facilitated and embodied. The transmission of Arabic philosophical and scientific texts to Europe through the Crusader connection, alongside the more famous Toledo translation movement in Spain, contributed to the intellectual revival of European civilization in the 12th and 13th centuries. Medical knowledge, agricultural techniques, architectural ideas, culinary traditions, musical forms, all of these moved back and forth across the boundaries that the Crusader kingdom simultaneously maintained and permeated. The political and religious legacy is more contested. The Crusades as a phenomenon occupy a complex and deeply contested place in the historical memory of multiple civilizations. For the Islamic world, the crusading period is a story of invasion, resistance, and eventual expulsion, a story that carries particular emotional and political resonance in the context of more recent history. For the Western Christian tradition, the Crusades have been subject to centuries of reinterpretation and reassessment, moving from the celebration of holy warriors to the critique of imperialism and religious violence, to more nuanced scholarly accounts that try to understand the phenomenon on its own terms without either apologizing for it or reducing it to simple moral categories. More stories from the world of the Crusades. Fragments of a larger world. The world of the Crusades was richer and stranger than any single narrative can contain, and Baldwin's story, extraordinary as it is, was just one thread in an enormous tapestry. Let us pull a few more threads, briefly, to give some sense of the larger fabric. There is the story of Usama ibn Munkid, the Syrian warrior poet and memoirist, who was a contemporary of Baldwin's father and grandfather, who fought against the Crusaders and hunted with them and exchanged philosophical conversations with their monks, and was, ultimately, one of the most perceptive observers of the period from an Islamic perspective. His memoirs, the Kitab al-Itibar, the Book of Learning by Example, are a masterpiece of medieval Arabic literature and an invaluable historical document full of stories about the encounter between Christian and Muslim culture that are funny and sad and strange and illuminating in equal measure. He describes Frankish knights as simultaneously admirable in their courage and baffling in their customs, as men who were genuinely fierce in battle and genuinely bizarre in their medical practices, as neighbours with whom a degree of modus vivendi was possible, and even occasionally pleasant. There is the story of the Jewish traveller Benjamin of Tudela, a Spanish Jew who travelled through the Mediterranean world, including the Holy Land, in the 1160s, and left a remarkable account of what he saw. His description of Jerusalem and its communities, the Jewish presence in the city, the relations between the various Christian sects, the trading patterns that connected the city to the broader world, gives us a perspective on the Crusader kingdom from outside all its dominant hierarchies. from a traveller who was neither crusader nor Muslim but something else entirely, a merchant and scholar from the Jewish diaspora, observing with curious and alert eyes everything that came before him. There is the story of Eleanor of Aquitaine, the extraordinary queen of both France and England who had participated in the Second Crusade in her own right, the only woman to do so at anything approaching a leadership level, and whose life represents, in compressed and dramatic form, many of the forces shaping the 12th century world that Baldwin inhabited. Eleanor was dead long before Baldwin was born, but the world she had helped make, the world of courtly culture and chivalric ideals, of strong-willed women negotiating the narrow passages available to them in a male-dominated political system, of the intersection of religious duty and personal ambition, was the world Baldwin grew up in and ruled. There is the story of Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor who took the cross and set out on the Third Crusade with a vast army, and who drowned in the Salef River in Anatolia in 1190 before he ever reached the Holy Land. His death was a military disaster. Much of his army dispersed and went home rather than continuing without him, and it illustrates with brutal economy the vulnerability of the entire crusading enterprise to the contingent hazards of individual human life. If Barbarossa had not drowned, if he had reached the Holy Land with his full force, the course of the Third Crusade might have been very different. There is the story of Saladin's death in 1193, the year after the Treaty of Jaffa. He died in Damascus, in his 55th year, not of a wound taken in battle, but of a fever that the great physician Ibn Abi Usaybiyah would later describe with clinical specificity. He had given away so much of his personal wealth in acts of generosity that when he died, there was not enough money in his treasury to pay for a proper funeral. The man who had reconquered Jerusalem, who had defeated the armies of 3 crusading kings, who had built an empire that stretched from Egypt to Syria, died without enough gold to bury himself with dignity. His biographers held this up as evidence of his virtue. It is, at the very least, evidence of something genuine about his character, that the accumulation of wealth was not in the end what drove him. There is the extraordinary story of the Crusade of Frederick II in 1229, when the Holy Roman Emperor, under excommunication from the Pope, without a single sword being drawn in anger, negotiated with the Ayyubid Sultan al-Kamil for the return of Jerusalem to Christian control for a period of 10 years. The negotiated return was deeply controversial on both sides. The Christians were appalled that their holy city was being handed over by a heretic through negotiation, rather than won by a holy army through divine favour, and the Muslims were outraged that their sultan had given away Al-Quds without a fight. Jerusalem briefly had Christian rulers again, and then was lost again, and the cycle of loss and hope and loss that characterised the entire crusading enterprise continued on its long, painful course. There is the story of the fall of Acre in 1291, the last Crusader city, the final fortress of a civilization that had lasted for nearly 2 centuries in the most contested piece of real estate in the medieval world. The Mamluks, who had replaced the Ayyubids as the dominant Islamic power in Egypt and Syria, besieged Acre in May 1291 with an enormous force. The defence was fierce. The Crusader defenders, including the Templars and Hospitallers, fought with the desperate courage of men who understood that this was the end, that there was no reinforcement coming, that the kingdom that had lasted since 1099 was drawing to its final breath. The city fell on the 18th of May. The last Crusaders retreated to the sea, some to ships, some to the sea itself. The kingdom of Jerusalem, the state for which Baldwin IV had sacrificed his body and eventually his life, was over. The education of a prince, what William of Tyre taught. The education that William of Tyre provided for the young Baldwin was comprehensive in the way that only a truly devoted and learned teacher can make it. William had spent years studying at the greatest schools of Europe, at Paris, where the great cathedral school and the emerging university were transforming the intellectual life of Western Christendom. At Bologna, where the revival of Roman law was creating an entirely new framework for thinking about governance and justice. And in the East, where his years in the Crusader kingdom had given him a practical education in the realities of political life that no amount of book learning could substitute for. He brought all of this to his teaching, and the young Baldwin absorbed it with the particular eagerness of a bright child who senses that knowledge is not merely an academic exercise but a practical tool for navigating a dangerous world. History was central to William's curriculum, and it is not difficult to understand why. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was a state with a brief, but already dramatic history of its own, and that history was directly relevant to the challenges the young king would face. Baldwin learned the story of the First Crusade, of the extraordinary journey of 1096 to 1099, of the sieges and the battles and the political negotiations, of the great figures who had made the kingdom possible. He learned about the reigns of his predecessors on the throne of Jerusalem, Godfrey of Bouillon, who had refused the title of king and called himself merely the advocate of the Holy Sepulchre, the first King Baldwin, Baldwin I, who had extended the kingdom's territory and consolidated its institutions, the second and third Baldwins, each of whom had faced their own versions of the eternal problem of the kingdom's precarious survival. He learned what had worked and what had failed. He was being shaped, whether either teacher or pupil fully realized it, into exactly the kind of king the kingdom needed most urgently, one who understood its history deeply enough to learn from it. Philosophy and theology were also part of the curriculum. William was a man of genuine theological learning, and he would have introduced his pupil to the great questions of Christian thought that shaped every aspect of the medieval world's understanding of itself. The relationship between faith and reason, a question being worked out with extraordinary vitality in the schools of Paris in exactly this period, in the work of thinkers like Peter Abelard and his successors. The nature of justice, both divine and human. The obligations of the Christian ruler, drawn from the rich tradition of political theology that ran from Augustine through Gregory the Great to the present. These were not abstract exercises for a future king. They were the intellectual framework within which every political decision would eventually be made, the vocabulary of values and justifications that a ruler needed to navigate his own choices and explain them to others. Languages, too, were part of the education. Latin was essential, the language of the church, of legal documents, of formal correspondence with the papacy and with European rulers, of the great library of intellectual and literary tradition that was the inheritance of every educated person in the Western Christian world. French, the vernacular language of the court, was Baldwin's native tongue, the language in which he thought and dreamed and argued. Arabic he would have had at least some exposure to, given the nature of the kingdom's daily life, and the presence of Arabic speakers throughout the social world of Jerusalem. Greek, perhaps. The Byzantine connection and the presence of Greek Orthodox Christians in the kingdom made some facility with Greek practically useful, as well as culturally significant. We can imagine William and his young pupil in the palace garden on a mild Jerusalem morning, the tutor patient and precise in his explanations, the boy quick with his questions, the interaction between teacher and student that is one of the most enduring and most essentially human of all forms of connection, the passing of knowledge and understanding from one generation to the next, the accumulation of civilization enacted in miniature in the space between two people who care about the same things. We can imagine this and then set it against what William would later write about the boy, the pride in his learning, the warmth of his affection, the quiet, devastating sorrow of the knowledge that was already growing even as the lessons continued, that the body sitting across the table from him was already being worked on by something that all his learning could do nothing to address, governing through pain the mechanics of a sick king's rule. The practical business of governing a medieval kingdom was enormously demanding in physical terms, and it is worth dwelling on exactly how Baldwin managed the mechanics of rule as his disease progressed, because the management of these mechanics was itself a kind of achievement, a daily negotiation between what needed to be done and what his body was capable of doing. The King's Council was the central institution of the kingdom's governance, a body composed of the great lords, the bishops, and the masters of the military orders, whose collective deliberation and approval was required for major decisions of policy. Baldwin presided over this council. In the early years of his reign, this was physically straightforward. A young man in a chair, gloved, covered, but present and active, following the debates with the quickness of his trained intelligence, intervening at the right moments, reading the political dynamics of the room, and managing them with the skill his education had given him. As the disease progressed, the physical presence became more complicated, but he found ways to continue. The council chamber was arranged to minimize the visibility of his condition. His voice, even when his body was most compromised, remained clear and authoritative. Leprosy in its progression attacks the face and extremities before it attacks the vocal cords, and Baldwin's voice, which had been trained through years of public speaking and ceremony, remained a powerful instrument long after other faculties were diminishing. The administration of justice was another central royal function, and one that Baldwin continued to exercise personally for as long as he physically could. The High Court of Jerusalem, the most important judicial body in the kingdom, met under the king's presidency and heard the great cases involving the feudal relationships of the kingdom. Disputes over fiefs and inheritances, accusations of treason, conflicts between the great lords that threatened the kingdom's internal peace. A king who could not or would not exercise this judicial function in person quickly lost the authority that came with it. Baldwin understood this, and he showed up. Even in the later years when showing up required arrangements that would have been demeaning for any other person, the litter, the additional coverings, the careful management of his limited stamina, he was there, present, functioning, unmistakably the king. His letters, the formal royal correspondence that was the primary medium of diplomacy in this pre-telephone age, were dictated because the physical act of writing had become impossible as his hands deteriorated. Dictation to a royal secretary was not unusual in this period. Many kings used secretaries as a matter of routine, but for Baldwin, the transition from writing to dictation was a specific moment in the progression of the disease, a specific loss, and we can imagine what it meant. The ability to put words on paper in one's own hand was, in the medieval world, more than merely practical. It was an expression of personal agency, of direct connection between thought and mark. When that connection was mediated through another person, something changed in the relationship between the king and his written words. He compensated by developing a remarkable precision in his dictated language. The letters and documents of his later reign are models of clarity and effectiveness, as if the loss of the physical act of writing had heightened his attention to the precision of the language itself. Sleep must have been one of the most private and most difficult dimensions of Baldwin's daily life. Lepromatous leprosy causes chronic pain, not the acute signal pain of injury or infection, but a deeper, more pervasive discomfort that comes from nerve damage and tissue deterioration, and the general systemic stress of fighting an infection that the body cannot defeat. Combined with the disruptions that a medieval royal life imposed, the irregular hours, the stress of governance, the particular psychological weight of knowing what was coming, Baldwin's nights were almost certainly difficult ones. Yet nothing in the historical record suggests that he allowed this to affect his public performance. Whatever happened in the dark hours, he was present and functional in the daylight ones. Whatever the night cost him, the day did not show it. How Saladin's world saw the Leper King. The Islamic sources of the 12th century give us a perspective on Baldwin and the Crusader kingdom that is both invaluable and inherently shaped by its own assumptions and purposes. These sources are not neutral, no sources are, but they are written from an entirely different cultural vantage point from the Latin chronicles, and reading them alongside William of Tyre and the other Western sources creates a stereoscopic depth of understanding that neither tradition alone can provide. Saladin's court produced several important historians and biographers, men whose task was to celebrate their patron's achievements and to frame the conflict with the Crusaders in terms that would resonate with Islamic values and theological frameworks. Baha'u'ddin ibn Shaddad, who was Saladin's close companion and wrote a detailed biography of him, provides some of the most intimate portraits of the Sultan in the sources. Imad ad-Din al-Isfahani, Saladin's personal secretary, wrote a detailed account of the campaigns and events of the period. These men were not disinterested observers, but they were careful observers, and their accounts contain information about the Crusader kingdom that illuminates the period in ways that the Western sources cannot. The Islamic sources do not generally dwell on Baldwin's leprosy in the way that might be expected from a medieval Christian perspective. This is partly because the Islamic understanding of disease was different from the Western Christian one. Disease was understood as a test from God, potentially ennobling rather than necessarily shaming, and the specific biblical stigma attached to leprosy in the Western tradition was not replicated in the same way in Islamic culture. The Arabic and Persian medical tradition viewed leprosy as a disease requiring medical management, not as a mark of divine disfavour. The Islamic sources note Baldwin's condition, but do not use it to diminish him. What they note more consistently is his courage and his strategic capability. There is a passage in one of the Islamic chronicles that describes Saladin's response to news of the Battle of Montchesade, the catastrophic defeat of 1177 at the hands of the young Leper King. The Sultan is described as retreating south toward Egypt, shaken by the loss, and as being reported to have expressed something that translates roughly as a frank acknowledgement of Baldwin's qualities as an adversary. This is remarkable in its own terms, coming from a man who was not in the habit of praising his enemies, whose public persona required the maintenance of confidence in the justice of his cause. The acknowledgement, filtered through layers of translation and cultural adaptation, feels genuine precisely because it is unexpected, and because it cost the person making it something in terms of the image they were projecting. Saladin's attitude toward Baldwin IV also reveals something important about the Islamic world's understanding of the Crusader presence in general. Saladin was not simply motivated by religious hatred of Christianity. His world was too complex and too pragmatic for such a simple emotional driver to be the whole explanation. He was pursuing a political and religious project that required the removal of Crusader control from Jerusalem specifically, not the elimination of Christians from the region generally. He understood the Crusader lords as political actors with their own internal divisions and their own strengths and weaknesses, and he managed his response to them with the flexibility that understanding provides. When Baldwin was king, he was a problem to be managed carefully, because he was smart and unpredictable, and capable of the kind of audacity that could upset the best-laid plans. When Guy took over, the calculations changed. The Knights of the Temple, power, faith, and the problem of autonomy. The Knights Templar were founded in approximately 1119, barely 20 years after the First Crusade, by a small group of French knights who dedicated themselves to the protection of pilgrims travelling to Jerusalem. They were initially so poor that, according to their own tradition, 2 knights shared a single horse, an image that became their famous seal, still recognizable after 9 centuries. Within a generation, they had become one of the wealthiest and most powerful institutions in Christendom, exempt from all taxation, accountable only to the Pope, possessors of properties and revenues across the entire Christian world, from Scotland to Cyprus. Their transformation from a handful of poverty-vowed knights to an international banking and military organisation is one of the most remarkable institutional stories of the medieval period. In the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Templars were an essential military asset. They maintained some of the most important fortifications in the kingdom and could field a substantial force of heavily armed cavalry, the most decisive military instrument of the age. But their independence from royal authority created persistent tensions with every king who tried to manage the kingdom's military strategy coherently. The Templars made their own decisions about when and whether to fight, about which truces to honour and which to ignore, about which alliances to make and which enemies to provoke. They were not simply tools of royal policy. They were a power unto themselves, and they sometimes used that power in ways that were genuinely damaging to the kingdom's interests. The relationship between Baldwin IV and the Templars was marked by this structural tension throughout his reign. At the Battle of Montgisard, the Templars had participated with crucial effectiveness. It was a Templar force that, along with Baldwin's knights and a contingent of infantry, had delivered the devastating charge. At other points in the reign, the Templars' tendency to act independently and their hawkish approach to Muslim opponents created complications that the king had to manage. Gerard of Ridfort's eventual emergence as Master of the Temple was a particularly difficult development. He combined personal resentments against the moderate faction with an aggressive military philosophy and the independence of his position to create a source of reliable destabilization in the kingdom's already fragile political balance. The Great Hospital, Medicine, Charity, and the Paradox of War. The Hospital of St. John in Jerusalem was, in the 12th century, among the most remarkable medical institutions in the world. Established initially as a hospice for pilgrims, a place of rest and care for the weary and the sick who arrived in Jerusalem after the long journey from Europe, it had evolved, under the leadership of successive masters, into a full medical hospital of genuine sophistication. By the time of Baldwin's reign, it was capable of caring for several hundred patients simultaneously, staffed by trained physicians and surgeons, maintained with resources drawn from the order's extensive European holdings. The medical care provided at the hospital was based on the best knowledge available in the 12th century. The physicians employed there had access to Arabic medical texts as well as the Latin tradition, and the practical experience of treating the wide variety of diseases and injuries that presented themselves in a pilgrim centre at the intersection of multiple climatic zones gave them a depth of clinical knowledge that went beyond what any single theoretical tradition could provide. They treated fever and dysentery and wounds and the chronic conditions that long travel imposed on the human body. They managed the dietary and pharmaceutical regimens prescribed for serious illness. They operated when surgery was deemed necessary, with techniques that were primitive by modern standards, but represented the best available understanding of human anatomy and the management of trauma. For Baldwin, the hospital represented both a practical medical resource and a kind of institutional expression of something he understood deeply from the inside. The imperative to care for the sick and injured as a religious and human duty, regardless of the cost or the difficulty. The military aspect of the Hospitaller Order, their evolution from pure caregivers into a fighting force that combined the functions of hospital and army, created a paradox that was in fact a very accurate reflection of the paradoxes of Crusader life in general. A world in which faith and violence, healing and killing, the imperatives of Christian charity and the imperatives of military survival existed not in contradiction, but in a kind of uncomfortable, permanent, unavoidable coexistence. the crusading ideal, faith, violence, and the long road from Clermont. To understand the world Baldwin IV inhabited, we must understand the extraordinary ideological force that had created that world and that continued to shape it throughout his life. The crusading movement was, at its root, an expression of one of the most powerful forces in medieval human psychology, the conviction that certain places and certain actions were so charged with sacred significance that participation in them could transform not merely the world but the soul. Pope Urban II's speech at Clermont in 1095, the speech that launched the First Crusade, was remarkable not only for its immediate effect, but for the depth of the psychological chord it struck. He was not merely calling for a military expedition. He was offering salvation. He was describing a universe in which the act of fighting for the Holy Sepulchre was itself a spiritual act, in which the violence of the battlefield could be sanctified by the correctness of the cause, in which the soldier who died in Jerusalem's defence could be confident of dying in the direct service of God. This idea, that violence, properly directed and properly motivated, could be holy, was theologically contentious even in Urban's own time. Augustine had argued for the legitimacy of certain wars that met specific criteria of just cause and right intention and proper authority. But the leap from justified violence to salvific violence, from war that was permissible to war that was meritorious, was a leap that many thoughtful Christians of the period found troubling. It was made anyway, and the momentum it generated changed the world. By the time Baldwin IV was born, the crusading idea had been operating for nearly 3 generations. It had produced not just the Kingdom of Jerusalem, but a whole culture of holy warfare, a set of ideals, practices, institutions, and expectations that shaped how the Christian West thought about the relationship between faith and force. The military orders, the Templars and Hospitallers, and later the Teutonic Knights, were direct institutional expressions of this culture, attempts to embody in permanent institutional form the combination of religious vocation and military function that the crusading ideal called for. The theology of the crusade had been worked out in increasingly sophisticated terms by Bernard of Clairvaux and others, providing intellectual justification for what began as an act of collective enthusiasm and giving it the framework of a proper doctrine. Baldwin grew up inside this culture and was entirely shaped by it. His understanding of his own role as a Christian king, as the defender of the Holy Sepulchre, as the sovereign of the kingdom that existed to protect the holy places, was formed within the crusading framework and could not be understood outside of it. His physical courage in battle was not merely a personal quality, it was a religious expression, a living out of the crusading ideal in his own particular and extraordinary circumstances. When he rode at the head of his knights towards Saladin's army at Montgisard, he was doing something that his entire cultural formation had prepared him to do, offering his body, such as it was, in service of the sacred cause that his kingdom represented. The impossible succession, every option, was a trap. The succession crisis that dominated the final years of Baldwin's reign was not, ultimately, his failure. It was a structural problem that the nature of his illness and the personalities of the available successors combined to create, and it would have been extraordinarily difficult to resolve even with a healthy king and a more cooperative court. But the manner in which it was handled, or rather mishandled, by those who followed him represents one of history's clearest examples of how great leadership cannot survive the institutions and individuals who inherit it. The problem was simple to state and nearly impossible to solve. Baldwin could not produce heirs. The succession therefore depended on Sibylla, and whoever Sibylla married would become king. But Sibylla had already demonstrated that she was not willing to have her choice of husband dictated by political calculation. She loved Guy of Lusignan, and she would not give him up, even when her brother made clear that he believed Guy was unfit to be king. And the men who opposed Guy, the Ibelins and their allies, had no mechanism for compelling Sibylla's compliance short of force, and using force against the Queen would have created a constitutional crisis worse than the one they were trying to prevent. The crowning of the young Baldwin V as co-king in 1183 was Baldwin's attempt to create a mechanism that would bypass the problem, to establish a male heir, however young and however sickly, whose existence would modify the succession dynamics enough to prevent Guy from simply inheriting by right of marriage. It worked while Baldwin was alive, while the force of his personality and the reality of his governance gave the arrangement its practical substance. When both Baldwin IV and Baldwin V died within the space of 2 years, the arrangement dissolved, and the succession fell to Sibylla and Guy, exactly as the moderate faction had feared. The attempt to undo this, made at Sibylla's coronation, the offer to crown her if she would first agree to dissolve her marriage to Guy, was in retrospect almost touching in its naivety about Sibylla's character and determination. The great lords who devised this scheme knew Sibylla was clever, but they apparently underestimated the depth of her commitment to Guy and her willingness to use the considerable leverage that the crown gave her to circumvent the conditions attached to it. She accepted the condition, was crowned, and then immediately exercised the prerogative of a queen to choose her own husband, which she did by recrowning Guy herself. The lords who had thought they were being clever found themselves outmanoeuvred by a woman who was cleverer, more determined, and more willing to act decisively than they had allowed for. There is a kind of bitter symmetry in this outcome. Baldwin had spent his entire reign managing the competing ambitions and poor judgments of the powerful men around him, using intelligence and will to compensate for the structural vulnerabilities of his position. In the end, it was not a man who undid his work, but his own sister, the person he had been closest to in his entire life, the person who had stood beside him through everything the disease and the kingdom had imposed. Sibylla loved her husband. She chose that love over everything else. It is difficult across 8 centuries to condemn her for it, but the consequences were what they were: the landscape of the kingdom, deserts, mountains, and the sea. The physical landscape of the Crusader kingdom was one of extraordinary variety, a compressed geography that contained within a relatively small area a remarkable range of environments, from the fertile coastal plain to the Judean hills to the Jordan Valley below sea level to the desert margins of the Negev. Understanding this landscape is important to understanding the military history of the period, because so much of what happened in that history was shaped by the land itself, by the location of water sources, by the defensibility of particular positions, by the routes that armies could and could not take through terrain that range from the readily traversable to the functionally impassable. The coast was the kingdom's lifeline, the string of port cities from Gaza in the south to Beirut in the north that maintained the connection to Europe and through which the supplies and reinforcements and pilgrims that the kingdom needed continuously flowed. The sea road, the Via Maris, the ancient highway that had been in use since before the oldest civilizations in the region, ran along the coastal plain through a landscape of orchards and fields and market towns, a relatively easy route for armies moving north and south. The Crusaders controlled this coast throughout Baldwin's reign, and its maintenance was a constant strategic priority. The Judean hills that rose from the coastal plain to the high ground on which Jerusalem sat were a different kind of terrain entirely, rocky, steep in places, threaded with valleys and passes that could be easily defended, but that also imposed significant logistical challenges on any army moving through them. Jerusalem itself sat on a ridge more than 2,000 feet above sea level, its elevation giving it both defensibility and a climate that was milder than the coastal lowlands in summer, cooler, clearer, the air thinner and brighter. The approach to the city from the west, from the direction of Jaffa, climbed steadily through the hills in a journey that is still a distinct experience today, the sense of rising toward something, of the landscape opening as the ascent continues, of the city appearing suddenly on its ridge with an impact that has been moving travellers to strong emotion since before the Christian era. The Jordan Valley and the eastern margins of the kingdom were another world entirely. Hot, arid, dramatic in their geology, the Dead Sea glittering more than 1,300 feet below sea level, in a landscape that felt genuinely primordial, stripped down to essentials of rock and light, and the occasional green thread of water along the Jordan River itself. The great castles of Transjordan, Kerak, Montreal, sat on volcanic plateaus in this landscape with an air of absolute, almost inhuman permanence, their stones the same colour as the rock they were built on, their shadows falling across the desert in the long horizontal light of morning and evening. Galilee in the north was gentler, a landscape of rolling hills and the large, still body of the Sea of Galilee, rimmed by the volcanic ridges that gave it its particular, slightly melancholy beauty. It was in this landscape that the Battle of Hattin would eventually be fought, on the volcanic plateau above the sea, under a July sun of killing intensity, with the wells dry and the springs of Sapphira hours of march behind the exhausted Crusader army. The landscape was not merely the backdrop of the battle, it was one of its decisive factors. Saladin knew the terrain perfectly and used his knowledge to channel the Crusader army into a position where the heat and the lack of water would do his work for him before his cavalry needed to. What came after? The long shadow of 1185. The period that followed Baldwin's death in 1185 moved with a particular acceleration of historical events that had been held back by extraordinary individual effort, and that, when that effort is removed, rush forward to their destined conclusions. The political crisis of the succession, the military catastrophe at Hattin, the fall of Jerusalem, these events came in rapid sequence, as if the pressure that had been contained for a decade by Baldwin's governance suddenly found its outlet the moment he was gone. The survivors of Hattin and the fall of Jerusalem dispersed across the remaining Crusader territories, primarily the coastal cities that Saladin had not yet been able to take. Tyre, in particular, held out under the leadership of Conrad of Montferrat, a remarkable military commander who arrived almost literally at the last possible moment to organise its defence. Conrad was Sibylla's first husband's brother, a man of considerable ability who had come to the Crusader East by a circuitous route and found himself, by accident rather than design, at the centre of the kingdom's last stand. His defence of Tyre in 1187 against Saladin's forces was one of the more impressive military achievements of the period, a holding action that preserved at least something of the Crusader presence until the Third Crusade could arrive. The Third Crusade, when it came, brought with it one of the great military figures of the medieval world, Richard I of England, whose arrival in 1191 transformed the military situation in the Holy Land with a speed and decisiveness that the exhausted defenders of the remaining Crusader positions must have found almost miraculous. Richard was in many ways the anti-Baldwin. Where Baldwin had been physically diminished, Richard was physically imposing to the point of legend. Where Baldwin had been compelled to fight with a sick body, Richard fought with a healthy one, and did so with ferocious effectiveness. But they shared something fundamental, the absolute refusal to be deterred by circumstances that would have stopped lesser men, and the ability to extract extraordinary military performance from soldiers who believed in them. The Treaty of Jaffa that Richard negotiated with Saladin in 1192 left Jerusalem in Muslim hands, but established a version of the Crusader presence in the Holy Land that would persist, in reduced form, for another century. The reduced kingdom, sometimes called the Kingdom of Acre, after its de facto capital, maintained the coastal strip and continued the pattern of pilgrim traffic, commercial activity, an intermittent conflict that had characterized the original kingdom. It was smaller and weaker and more precarious than what Baldwin had defended, but it survived. In a certain ironic sense, the world that Baldwin had died to preserve, reduced, transformed, but not entirely gone, outlasted him by 100 years. The question of what would have happened had Baldwin not died young, had his disease been less severe, had he ruled until middle age rather than dying at 23, is one that historians approach with the appropriate caution that counterfactual speculation deserves, but it is a question that suggests itself irresistibly. The underlying structural problems of the kingdom, the inadequacy of its manpower, the hostility of its neighbours, the internal divisions of its court, would not have been solved by any individual ruler, however brilliant. But the specific catastrophe of 1187, the particular cascade of poor decisions that led to Hattin, was not structural. It was human. It was the product of specific individuals making specific bad choices, and it is very difficult, knowing what we know about Baldwin's military judgment, to believe that he would have made those choices. He had faced Saladin's army before with a fraction of the force that Guy commanded at Hattin, and he had won. He had faced the same army with a larger force at Safaria in 1183, and had refused, on ground of his own choosing, to give battle on Saladin's terms, and he had been proved right. The strategic intelligence that had kept the kingdom alive for a decade did not simply vanish with its owner's death. It was not transferred to anyone, because no one in the succession possessed anything like it. Leprosy through history, a disease that changed the world. Leprosy is one of the oldest diseases in the human record. Evidence of its presence goes back thousands of years, found in skeletal remains from India and Egypt and the Near East that show the characteristic bone damage of lepromatous leprosy. It appears in some of the oldest medical texts in existence, in the Sushruta Samhita of ancient India, in Egyptian papyri, in the biblical texts that are among the most ancient documents of the Near Eastern literary tradition. It was feared and stigmatized throughout this long history, and the fear and the stigma shaped the lives of millions of people who contracted it across the millennia. The medieval period represents in many ways the height of leprosy's social stigmatization in the Western world. The combination of the biblical tradition, the association with impurity and sin, and the visible, disfiguring nature of the disease's progression created a social response that was often brutal in its effects. The exclusion of lepers from ordinary society, the requirement of distinctive clothing, and the carrying of a bell or rattle to warn others of their approach, the confiscation of their property in some legal traditions, the prohibition on entering churches, markets, and other shared spaces. Leprosy made its sufferers, in a formal and institutionalized way, non-persons, outsiders from the community of the healthy and the socially included. Against this background, the career of Baldwin IV stands as something genuinely anomalous in the history of the disease, a case in which the social exclusion that leprosy normally imposed was not merely modified, but effectively reversed, in which the sufferer became instead the centre of social and political life, the person everyone else's existence organised itself around. This reversal was not achieved by denying the disease or pretending it did not exist. It was achieved by making it irrelevant, by demonstrating through action that the qualities of mind and character that made a person worth following had nothing to do with the condition of their skin. The modern understanding of leprosy, Hansen's disease named for the Norwegian physician who identified its bacterial cause in 1873, is radically different from the medieval one. It is now known to be far less contagious than previously believed. Prolonged, close contact is generally required for transmission, and most people are naturally immune. It is treatable. The multi-drug therapy developed in the 20th century can cure leprosy completely if caught in its early stages, and manage it effectively even in more advanced cases. The WHO declared leprosy eliminated as a public health problem globally in 2000, though it continues to affect hundreds of thousands of new cases annually, primarily in tropical regions. The transformation in our understanding and management of the disease that Baldwin suffered from is one of the clearest illustrations of the distance between the medical world of his time and our own. The archaeology of the Crusader kingdom, what the ground remembers. The physical traces of the Crusader kingdom are scattered across a landscape that has been continuously inhabited and continuously transformed since the end of the crusading period. Archaeologists working in Israel, the Palestinian territories, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria have been excavating these traces for decades, and what they have found both confirms and complicates the picture that the written sources provide. The great fortifications are the most obvious and most studied elements of the material record. The Crac des Chevaliers in Syria, remarkably well preserved, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, gives the best sense available of what a major Crusader fortress looked like and how it functioned. The castle complexes at Kerak and Shobak in Jordan, though less well preserved, convey the extraordinary scale and ambition of the Crusader fortification program in the territories east of the Dead Sea. In Israel, the coastal fortifications at Caesarea, the fortress at Belvoir overlooking the Jordan Valley, and the fragmentary remains of many smaller castles and towers tell the story of a military infrastructure that was, in its time, among the most sophisticated in the world. Less visible, but no less historically significant, are the remains of the economic and social infrastructure of the kingdom. The sugar processing facilities in the coastal plain, the evidence of agricultural development in the Galilee, the church buildings that survive as mosques or in ruined form across the landscape, the market buildings and caravanserais that supported the trade economy. These material traces remind us that the Crusader kingdom was not merely a military installation, but a functioning society with an economy and a daily life that extended far beyond the battlefield and the palace. The archaeological work of recent decades has also provided important evidence about the lives of ordinary people in the Crusader kingdom, the non-noble, non-clerical population, whose existence is largely invisible in the written sources but whose labour supported the entire enterprise. The excavations at Arcieux, modern Apollonia, at Montfort, at various sites along the coast, have revealed the material culture of a society that was, in its everyday dimensions, more cosmopolitan and more hybrid than the formal historical narrative sometimes suggests. Pottery that blends Western and Eastern traditions, food remains that reflect the dietary practices of multiple cultures, building techniques that draw on local expertise as well as imported European methods. The memory of Jerusalem, why the city endures. Jerusalem has been destroyed and rebuilt, conquered and lost, held and surrendered more times than any other city in the world, for which we have a detailed historical record. It has been the capital of the ancient Israelite kingdom and the site of the first and second temples. It has been captured by Babylonians and Persians and Macedonians and Romans. It has been a Roman colony, a Byzantine Christian city, the first city to fall to the Islamic expansion out of Arabia in the 7th century. It has been a Crusader capital, a Mamluk provincial city, an Ottoman administrative centre, a city divided by a wall of concrete and wire in the 20th century, and a city that is today the subject of one of the most intractable political disputes in the world. And yet through all of this, through every conquest and loss and transformation, it has retained its power over the human imagination in a way that no purely political or military explanation can fully account for. People do not feel about other cities the way they feel about Jerusalem. The attachment is not rational, not purely historical, not reducible to any single political or religious interest. It is something deeper than all of these things, a sense held by billions of people across 3 faiths and dozens of cultures, that this place is in some fundamental way irreplaceable, that it represents something about human meaning and human aspiration and human connection to the sacred that cannot be moved or reproduced or substituted. Baldwin IV understood this. He lived it. It was the operative premise of his entire existence and his entire sacrifice. The city he was fighting for was not merely a strategic position, or a political symbol or an economic asset, though it was all of these things. It was the city that represented, in the deepest layer of his cultural formation, the intersection of the human and the divine, the place where God had walked in human flesh, where the most important story in his understanding of the universe had unfolded, where the tomb that had been found empty on the first Easter morning was tended and venerated by a community that had been doing so since within living memory of the event itself. We do not have to share Baldwin's faith to understand that this conviction, held as genuinely and as deeply as any conviction a person can hold, gave his sacrifice a quality of meaning that extended far beyond personal courage or political calculation. He was not merely a king managing a border province. He was, in his own understanding, the steward of the most sacred trust in Christendom, the guardian of the place that his entire civilization understood as the centre of all human history. That understanding did not require him to be naive about the geopolitical realities of his situation. It did not prevent him from being a pragmatist when pragmatism was what the moment required. But it did provide a depth of motivation that kept him going through circumstances that would otherwise have been simply impossible to survive. This combination of deep faith and practical intelligence, of the conviction that what he was doing mattered in an absolute and ultimate sense, and the clear-eyed understanding of exactly what needed to be done to make the momentary survival of that cause possible, is perhaps the most characteristically medieval thing about Baldwin IV, and also, paradoxically, one of the most recognisably human. People in every age who do extraordinary things tend to be animated by something that connects the immediate practical task to a larger framework of meaning. The form of that framework changes. It is political, religious, philosophical, personal, depending on the person and the age. But the function it performs is constant. It is the thing that makes the cost worthwhile. It is the answer when the body says enough that allows the will to say, not yet. A final accounting, 11 years, 1 life, everything given. Let us make a final accounting of what Baldwin IV accomplished in his brief reign, because the accounting matters, and because it is easy to let the pathos of his story, the sickness, the suffering, the knowledge of his early death, the eventual fall of Jerusalem 4 years after he was gone, obscure what the record actually shows. He inherited a kingdom in crisis and kept it functioning for 11 years. During those 11 years he faced Saladin, then at the peak of his power, commanding resources that dwarfed anything the Crusader kingdom could field, in multiple military confrontations, and was not destroyed. He won at Montgisar, arguably the most remarkable Crusader military victory of the entire post-First Crusade period. He managed the defensive standoff at Safaria in 1183 with strategic intelligence that prevented the kind of catastrophic defeat that Hattin would later provide. He administered justice, managed the kingdom's finances, conducted diplomacy, and maintained the institutions of the kingdom through a period of extraordinary internal and external pressure. He did all of this while managing a progressive and disfiguring disease that robbed him, year by year, of the physical capacities that medieval kingship most conspicuously required. He did it while navigating a court full of ambitious and sometimes actively hostile figures who saw in his illness an opportunity for their own advancement. He did it while knowing, with the kind of clarity that his intelligence and his teachers had equipped him for, that the long-term strategic situation of the kingdom was deteriorating, and that the tools available to address it were inadequate. He was, in the end, insufficient to save everything. But the standard against which his achievements should be measured is not the impossible standard of permanent salvation. No individual ruler could have provided that for the Crusader kingdom, given its structural vulnerabilities. The standard is the standard of what was reasonably possible, what could have been expected of someone in his position, what the kingdom had a right to hope for from its king. Against that standard, Baldwin IV did not fall short. He exceeded it, by a margin so wide that it constitutes not merely success, but something approaching the miraculous, the achievement that redefines what success in those circumstances could look like. He was 23 years old when he died. He had been ill since childhood. He had been king since he was 13. He had never had an ordinary day in his adult life, never a day without the disease, without the governance, without the weight of the kingdom, and the shadow of the enemy, and the particular kind of grief that comes from knowing, with certainty, that the clock is running. And yet, and this is the thing that the historical record preserves, across all the centuries and all the translation, and all the distance between his world and ours, he was also a person who loved horses, who had a quick intelligence that delighted in learning, who cared for his sister and his mother, who commanded the respect of men who were among the finest warriors of their age, who earned, from the greatest military adversary of the period, something that sounds, even through the filter of 8 centuries, like genuine admiration. These things coexisted in him, the tragedy and the triumph, the suffering and the brilliance, the daily diminishment and the persistent, inextinguishable will. They coexisted not in spite of each other, but in some deep way because of each other, because a person who has been stripped of everything they cannot absolutely guarantee will not be taken, who has had to find the floor of what they actually are below all the ordinary layers of comfort and assumption, has access to something that the merely healthy and the merely comfortable and the merely unchallenged never quite find. Baldwin IV found it. He found it in a palace in Jerusalem, with a teacher who loved him, and a disease already working its invisible way through his peripheral nervous system, with a kingdom of unimaginable richness and unimaginable danger spread out around him in all directions. He found it, and he used it, and he kept using it until there was nothing left to use, and then he rested. And the long, slow, luminous patience of Jerusalem received him back into its ancient stone and its ancient light, as it has received everyone who has given themselves to it, with a silence that is not indifference, but simply the particular patience of a very old and very sacred place that has been receiving the offered lives of those who love it since before the beginning of any history we can read. There is a quality that the historians call virtues, a Latin word that carries within it an idea much larger than its usual English translation of virtue. Virtues was, in the classical tradition, and in the medieval understanding that drew on it, the full expression of human excellence. Courage, yes, but also moral integrity, practical wisdom, the capacity to act effectively in the world, and to do so for reasons that transcended mere self-interest. It was the quality that separated those who merely had power from those who were worthy of it. It was the quality that, in the medieval Christian framework that shaped every aspect of Baldwin's world, pointed toward the divine image in which human beings were made, the image of a God who had chosen to enter history in a human body and to redeem it from within its own fragility, rather than simply overriding that fragility from outside. Baldwin IV had virtues in abundance. This is what makes his story, across 8.5 centuries, still feel vital and still feel true and still feel like it matters. Not the facts of it, though the facts are extraordinary. Not the drama of it, though the drama is genuine. But the quality of being that the facts and the drama point toward, a human being, confronted with circumstances that would have destroyed a lesser person, choosing not to be destroyed. Let us think about what it means to choose persistence in the face of a situation that persistence cannot change. Baldwin knew from a fairly early age that he was going to die of his disease. He knew that the process of dying was going to be long and painful and progressively humiliating in the ways that a disease which attacks the body's surface attacks it, visibly, undeniably in public. He knew that his inability to produce heirs meant that the kingdom he was holding together would pass to others, and he had formed a clear-eyed judgment about the inadequacy of those others. He could not fix any of these things. He could not cure himself. He could not change who Sibylla loved. He could not make Guy of Lusignan into a better commander than he was. The circumstances were what they were. What he could do, what he chose every single day to do, was show up, to be king, to bring to every crisis, every battle, every council, every diplomatic negotiation, the full force of whatever he had available. When that was health and strength and the ability to lead from horseback, he led from horseback. When it was a litter and a voice that people had to lean in to hear, and eyes that could no longer quite focus on the faces around him, he led from the litter in the voice they leaned in to hear, with the mind that illness had not touched. This is the heart of Baldwin's story, and it is a story that speaks across all the centuries between his life and ours, because it addresses something fundamental about what human beings are and what they are capable of. We are, all of us, subject to the diminishment that time and illness and loss impose on the body. We are, all of us, living inside a physical machine that will eventually fail us, that is always, in some sense, in the process of failing us. The question that Baldwin's story asks, that it asks not theoretically but through the evidence of his actual life, is what we do with that knowledge. Whether we let it be the end of our engagement with the world, or whether we find in the deepest layer of ourselves something that the disease cannot touch and that insists, regardless of what the body is doing, on continuing. There is also something profound in Baldwin's story about the relationship between leadership and suffering. The most common model of leadership in the medieval world, the model that most of his contemporaries understood as natural and proper, was leadership through physical superiority. The king was supposed to be the strongest man, the best fighter, the most impressive physical presence. He was supposed to inspire by the quality of his body as well as the quality of his mind. Baldwin could not offer that. His body, far from inspiring confidence, was actively disturbing to many of those who encountered it. The disfigured face, the gloved hands, the covering robes, the eventual blindness and inability to walk. None of this fit the expected model, and yet he inspired loyalty. He inspired genuine devotion from men who were among the most accomplished warriors of their age. He inspired respect from an enemy as formidable as Saladin. He held a fractious, divided court together through the force of his personality and the quality of his judgment in circumstances that would have fractured any lesser character. How? The answer must be, at least in part, that the very nature of his leadership exercised entirely through intelligence and will, with no recourse to physical impressiveness, revealed something about the relationship between competence and character that the normal model of kingship obscured. When all the physical advantages are stripped away, what remains? What makes a person worth following? The answer Baldwin's life gives is the quality of the mind and the depth of the commitment to something larger than personal survival. His story is also, quietly, a story about what love looks like when it cannot take the forms we most associate with it. Baldwin could not embrace the people he loved. He could not, in the later stages of his illness, be held or hold. The physical expressions of affection that are among the most basic human comforts, the hand on the shoulder, the embrace in time of grief, the physical presence that says with the body what words sometimes cannot say, were taken from him by the disease and by the fear, rational and irrational, that his presence inspired. What remained was the love expressed through commitment, through showing up, through sacrificing what he might have chosen for his own comfort in favour of what the people who depended on him needed. It was a stripped, austere love, a love that had been forced to find its expression through will and action rather than through warmth and touch. And it was, by every measure that matters, genuine and great. There is something in this that resonates beyond the medieval context, beyond the specific history of the Crusader kingdom. It resonates with anyone who has had to find ways to love and be present, and continue functioning through the kind of circumstances that strip away the easy forms of presence and force you back to the essentials. It resonates with caregivers and with the cared for, with people managing their own diseases or the diseases of those they love, with everyone who has ever had to figure out how to keep going when the straightforward path is simply not available. Baldwin's story does not offer comfort in any easy or sentimental sense. It does not promise that courage and intelligence and will are always enough to overcome what they face. They were not always enough for him. The kingdom fell in the end, and the city he died for was lost 4 years after he was gone. But it offers something more honest than easy comfort. It offers evidence. Evidence that the human capacity to continue, to function, to create and protect and care for others even within the most constrained and painful of circumstances is real. Not a metaphor, not an aspiration, not a legend, but something that actually happened in a specific time and place, in the body and mind of a specific young man named Baldwin, who was king of Jerusalem from the age of 13 until his death at 23, and who during those 10 years did things that are genuinely worth remembering. The city of Jerusalem still stands. It has been besieged and captured and lost and won and contested more times than any other city in the long, violent human story of this planet, and it stands still, the pale stone buildings catching the late afternoon light in that particular golden way that travellers who have been there describe with a particular quality of wonder in their voices, as if the light itself remembers everything it has ever illuminated in this place. The walls that Baldwin defended, some of them rebuilt, some of them replaced, some of them standing in forms that would be recognisable to him, still enclose the old city. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre still draws pilgrims from every Christian community in the world. The Dome of the Rock still catches the morning sun and sends its golden light across the city. The Al-Aqsa Mosque still receives its worshippers. The narrow streets still carry the scent of spices and fresh bread, and the particular smell of old stone in morning air. The city is older and newer and stranger than it has ever been, and still charged with that particular quality of meaning that causes people to cross continents and oceans to stand inside it. Somewhere under its stones, in a location that has been the subject of significant scholarly debate and has not been definitively resolved, lies what remains of Baldwin IV. He was buried in Jerusalem, in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, with the other kings of the Crusader kingdom. His grave, if it survived the city's subsequent history, has not been identified with certainty. He lies somewhere in the stones of the city he served, unmarked or imperfectly marked, dissolving into the ancient deep dust that holds all of the city's dead. It is worth sitting with this image for a moment. Baldwin gave everything, gave his health, gave his comfort, gave the ordinary human hopes for family and future that most people hold as the most fundamental things worth preserving, to this city. He gave it a decade of extraordinary effort from a body that had every reason to quit. He fought for it when he could barely see it. He planned its defense from a litter. He sacrificed his relationships and his potential for ordinary happiness to the demands of governance in a crisis that never entirely abated. And then he died, at 23, and the city he had poured himself into was lost, as he had perhaps known it would be 4 years later. And he lies now in its foundations, dissolved into the same pale stone and ancient dust, part of the city in the most literal sense, the city that is built layer by layer from everything that has been given to it across 3,000 years of human devotion. There is a medieval concept, popular in the devotional literature of the period Baldwin inhabited, called the contemptus mundi, the contempt of the world, a spiritual posture that recommended the detachment of human longing from the things of this transitory life, on the grounds that everything earthly would pass and only the eternal would endure. Baldwin's life, read from one angle, could look like an illustration of this concept. Everything he worked for was lost. The kingdom fell. The city was taken. The great project of the crusading movement ended ultimately in failure. What was the point? What did any of it mean? But there is another way to read it, a way that takes the actual human experience of Baldwin's life more seriously and finds in it not illustration of contemptus mundi, but its opposite, an argument for the world, for engagement with the world, for the extraordinary and irreducible value of what a person does with the years they're given. Baldwin was not detached from the world. He was the opposite of detached. He was so deeply engaged with the world, so entirely committed to its specific human and political realities, that he gave literally everything he had to that engagement. The argument his life makes is not that nothing matters because everything passes. The argument his life makes is that things matter precisely because they are transient, precisely because the time in which they can be done and defended and cared for is limited, and the person doing and defending and caring is always, already, in the process of being taken away from them. He understood time in the particular way that people understand it when they know it is running out. This is one of the stranger and more painful gifts of serious illness. The acceleration of awareness, the heightening of attention, the removal of the comfortable illusion that there will always be more time. Baldwin knew from a relatively young age that his time was limited, that the disease was on a schedule he could not negotiate with. And what he did with this knowledge was not to retreat into acceptance or resignation. What he did was act, with everything available to him, for as long as he possibly could, beyond what anyone had any right to expect from a body that limited and a situation that extreme. The Battle of Montgisard stands as perhaps the most crystalline emblem of this quality. 500 knights, a boy king on horseback whose hands could not feel the reins he was holding, riding full tilt into an army of 30,000 men. By any reasonable calculation, this was not merely improbable, but impossible. The odds were not merely unfavourable, they were the kind of odds that sensible people calculate and then step back from, because the calculus of survival suggests that you do not ride full tilt into an army of 30,000 men with 500. Except that sometimes, rarely, but sometimes, when the timing is exactly right, and the commander's judgment is exactly right, and the element of surprise is exactly right, you do, and it works, and the pages of history carry the record of it forever. 848 years ago, give or take, a boy on horseback won a battle he should not have been able to win. He won it with a body that was already failing him, in a kingdom that was already in trouble, against an enemy who would eventually overwhelm it. He won it with whatever combination of tactical genius and physical courage, an absolute refusal to accept the limitations that reasonable calculation would have imposed. He won it, and the kingdom survived that particular crisis, and the city he loved continued to stand for 8 more years, and the pilgrims continued to come to the church of the Holy Sepulchre, and the morning sun continued to light the pale stone of the city in gold, and for a while, for as long as he could hold it together, it was enough. There are people in every age who refuse to be merely the sum of their constraints, who find, somewhere in the deepest architecture of their character, a resource that the constraints cannot touch, a stubbornness, a commitment, a love fierce enough to override everything the world has arranged against it. These people are not common. They are recognizable across all the centuries and all the circumstances that divide us from them by the particular quality of what they do, not ordinary achievement in difficult circumstances, but the kind of achievement that makes observers doubt what they are seeing, because it seems to violate something fundamental about what was supposed to be possible. Baldwin IV was one of these people. He was a child king in a dying kingdom with a fatal disease who somehow, for the most important decade of the kingdom's life, held everything together. He did it without health. He did it without the prospect of a future. He did it despite the constant, grinding, institutional resistance of the people around him who should have been his greatest support. He did it with pain as his constant companion, with the knowledge of his own approaching death as the background condition of every decision he ever made, with a body that was slowly becoming a prison even as his mind remained as clear and as sharp and as alive as it had ever been. And then he set it down. He set it down in the spring of 1185, when the disease had finally taken enough of him that even his extraordinary will could not compensate for what was gone. He set down the crown and the burden and the daily heroism and the magnificent, painful effort of it all. He was 23 years old. He had done more, with the years he was given, than most people manage in a full and healthy life. The evening comes gently to Jerusalem in spring. The light shifts from the hard, bright clarity of the afternoon to something softer and more golden, a light that forgives the sharpness of things, that blurs the edges and makes the pale stone glow with a warmth that seems to come from within the buildings themselves rather than from the sky. The city breathes out slowly in the cooling air. The evening prayer drifts from minarets across the rooftops. The bells of the churches respond in their own register. The market streets begin to quiet. The last pilgrims of the day make their way back from the holy places, carrying within them whatever they found there: peace, or hope, or simply the knowledge of having stood in a place that meant something larger than themselves. In this light, in this evening, it is possible to imagine Baldwin IV, not the historical figure, not the subject of scholarly analysis, but the person, the young man, finding something like peace, not the peace of having succeeded entirely, because he did not succeed entirely, not the peace of having saved everything he tried to save, because he did not save everything, but the peace of having tried, of having brought everything he was to the thing that was asked of him, of having been, within his extraordinary and painful and abbreviated life, genuinely present, genuinely, fully, unspokenly present to the world he inhabited and the people who depended on him and the cause he served. The Leper King. The name carries, for those who know the story, something different from what it first appears to carry. It is not a name of pity, though there is pity enough in the story for anyone who reads it with an open heart. It is not even primarily a name of tragedy, though tragedy is woven through every chapter of the life it names. It is, if you look at it straight and long, a name of extraordinary honour, the kind of honour that can only be given by the combination of suffering and response to suffering that Baldwin demonstrated year after year, battle after battle, crisis after crisis, until the end. He was the Leper King. He was 23 when he died. He was one of the most remarkable human beings who ever sat on a throne and tried to hold a world together. And the pale stone of Jerusalem, which has absorbed the hopes and prayers and losses of 3,000 years of human devotion, holds him still, somewhere in its ancient, patient, luminous depth, as it holds everything that has ever been genuinely and wholly given to it. The stars appear one by one over the city, the same stars that appeared over it in 1185, the same stars that will appear over it long after everything that we have discussed tonight has been covered over by layers of new history, new stone, new human devotion, and human failure and human endurance. The city that was fought for and died for and dreamed of. The kingdom that lasted 2 centuries in the most impossible circumstances imaginable. The king who held it together and who is still, across all these centuries, worth knowing. Good night.